Vernon Pike didn't even look up from his ledger when he gave the order. "Fence it," he said. "All of it. Every inch of that creek access." His foreman shifted his weight. "That'll cut off the Rourke cattle from water, mister." "Pike, in this cold, those animals will— I know what it'll do." Pike finally looked up. His eyes were flat and patient, the way a man looks when he's already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. That's the point. He went back to his numbers. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 15 below zero. 90 cattle, 2 children, 1 broken-handed man. And somewhere out on that frozen Dakota plain, a woman who had arrived as a stranger and was about to become the only thing standing between an entire family and ruin. If that were your family, if everything you'd built was being taken piece by piece by a man who simply had more money, what would you do? Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay with this story to the end. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves, you give it a like. It tells me to keep going now. Let's go back to where it all began. The train was 12 minutes late, which gave Silas Rourke just enough time to stand on that platform and feel like a complete fool. He'd worn his good coat. That was the thing that kept running through his head as he stood there in the November wind, watching the locomotive drag itself into Crooked Creek Station like something exhausted and reluctant. He'd worn his good coat, which meant he'd had to dig it out from the chest at the foot of the bed, which meant he'd had to move Margaret's shawl to get to it, and he hadn't touched that shawl in 2 years. And doing it that morning had nearly broken him before the day even started. He was 36 years old, and already he felt like a man twice that. Around him, the usual scattering of people waited: a grain merchant, 2 ranch hands picking up supplies, the station master's wife who had no particular business being there, but was there anyway, because in a town like Crooked Creek, any arriving train was better entertainment than most. Silas caught her looking at him. She looked away first, which he supposed was something. He was, after all, the man who'd put an advertisement in 3 separate newspapers asking for a woman willing to be his wife. There wasn't a dignified way to stand on a railway platform after that. The advertisement had taken him 4 drafts. He'd written "capable woman sought" in the first one and stared at it for 20 minutes before deciding that was honest if nothing else. He wasn't looking for romance. He wasn't looking for someone to love. He was looking for someone to survive with. There was a difference, and he thought any sensible woman would understand that difference better than a man who still sometimes sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and couldn't remember why he'd bothered to eat supper. He had 90 cattle, 340 acres of Dakota grassland, 1 broken-down forge that hadn't been lit in 11 years, and 2 kids who needed more than he had left to give them. Calder, his son, had turned 11 in September and spent most of his days with a jaw set like he was mad at the world for personal reasons he wasn't sharing. Maisie was 6 and still asked questions. Silas couldn't answer not the hard ones about where Mama was. He'd managed those as best he could, but the small daily ones. Why did the porridge taste different? Whether they could put a candle in the window at Christmas. Whether anyone was going to fix her doll's arm. The doll's arm had been broken since April. He'd tried twice. Both times his hands had betrayed him. His hands. That was the other thing. The other thing that had happened, the thing before Margaret's death, and somehow also because of it, because he'd been the one up on that barn roof in February, 3 years ago, trying to fix the weather vane in conditions he had no business being out in, and he'd fallen. And the landing had done something to the tendons in both hands that no doctor in the territory had fully explained to him, except to say that the grip would never come back. Not the way it was. He could hold things. He could manage. But fine work, sustained force, anything that required what hands are actually supposed to do gone. A rancher without hands was a particular kind of failure. The kind other men didn't say out loud but communicated anyway through the specific way they offered to help. So yes, he'd advertised for a wife. Her name was supposed to be Clara Beecham, 27 years old, originally from Minnesota, described by the matchmaking agency as practical-minded and accustomed to hard work. She had written him 1 letter, which was more formal than warm but contained No obvious lies, and they had reached an agreement by mail that she would arrive on the 3rd of November, and they would marry before the end of the month. That was the plan. The train stopped. Steam hissed out in great white clouds along the platform. The doors opened. Silas watched the passengers come out. A family with 3 young children and the particular haggard look of people who'd been traveling too long. An older man in a city suit who immediately looked around for someone to be disappointed in. A woman in green who wasn't Clara Beecham because she was at least 50 and walking toward the grain merchant with her arms already open. He waited. The station master's wife was still watching him. He waited. The platform was emptying. He was beginning to understand what was happening, the specific kind of understanding that arrives slowly, even when every fact is already assembled when the last person stepped off the train. She was not Clara Beecham. Silas knew this, because Clara Beecham's letter had described herself as slight and fair, and this woman was neither. She was tall, taller than he'd expected, though he couldn't have said why he expected anything with dark hair pinned back in a no-nonsense way, and she was carrying a bag over one shoulder. But it was what came after her that made Silas and the station master's wife and the 2 ranch hands all look twice. A porter struggled down behind her carrying a tool chest. It was not a small tool chest. It was the kind of thing that belonged in a professional shop, iron-strapped and heavy, the leather handles worn to the specific shine of something used constantly over a long period of time. The porter set it down on the platform with the careful relief of a man who was glad to be done with it, and the woman pulled a coin from her coat pocket without looking at him, pressed it into his hand, and turned to face the mostly empty platform. Her eyes landed on Silas. She seemed to assess him with the efficiency of someone who doesn't have time to waste on false impressions. "You're Silas Rourke," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said, and then because the chest was still sitting there, and Clara Beecham was still not here, "Where's Miss Beecham?" The woman's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. "Married," she said, 3 weeks ago. A farmer outside Fargo. "She asked me to bring you this." She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced an envelope. "Your money. Full amount. She wanted you to have it back." Silas didn't take the envelope immediately. He was still looking at the tool chest. "And you are Mara Veldt." She held the envelope out another inch. "I was her neighbor. I was heading west anyway. She asked if I'd deliver it." Took the envelope. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the tool chest, which was, he was increasingly certain, the most professionally outfitted piece of luggage he had ever seen on a railway platform in his life. "Heading west to where?" he asked. A brief pause. The kind that tells you the person has been waiting for exactly this question. "Hadn't decided yet," Mara said. The wind came through the platform at that moment, the way Dakota wind does in November, not politely, not gradually, but with the flat intention of a thing that doesn't care what you're doing or how you're dressed. The station master's wife pulled her collar up. The ranch hands moved toward their wagon. Silas felt it go through his good coat like the coat wasn't there. Mara Veldt looked at the wind as if she was taking its measure. Then she looked back at him. "I'm a blacksmith," she said. "Trained properly, not self-taught. I had my own shop in Fargo for 4 years. Lost it." She said this last part without ceremony, the way you state a fact that's already been grieved and doesn't need more time spent on it. "I saw your advertisement when Clara showed it to me. I know what you were looking for. I'm not that, obviously." She glanced briefly in the direction of his coat, his hands, the whole situation of him standing on a platform in his good coat with an empty envelope in one hand. "But I know what your ranch probably needs, and I need somewhere to survive the winter." Silas was quiet for a moment. Behind him, he was fairly certain the station master's wife had not moved even slightly. "You're not the bride I expected," he said. It was possibly the most obvious thing he'd ever said aloud. Mara Veldt looked at him for just a moment before the corner of her mouth moved. "Then maybe you got lucky," she said. He stood there in the November wind with Clara Beecham's money in his hand and a blacksmith he'd never met watching him figure out what to do next. His coffee had gone cold. His good coat was useless. His cattle needed water they were having trouble getting. His kids needed things he didn't know how to give them. His spring was drying up in ways that didn't make sense. And the man who most wanted his land had been making very quiet, very deliberate moves for the past several months. Silas was a practical man. He had been before everything, trying to be again. He looked at the tool chest. "Can you fix a forge that hasn't been lit in 11 years?" he asked. Mara looked at him steadily. "Depends on what's wrong with it." "I don't know what's wrong with it." "Then yes," she said. "Probably." He picked up one end of the tool chest. It was heavier than he'd expected, and his hands objected immediately, the familiar grinding protest from tendons that would never forgive him. He managed it. He didn't show what it cost him, which was its own kind of work. Mara picked up the other end without comment. She didn't offer to take his side. She didn't make a face. She just lifted her half and waited. They carried it to his wagon together. The ride back to Red Willow Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road. The road in November was not good. Silas drove, which gave him something to do with his hands that wasn't obvious, and Mara sat beside him and looked at the land. She didn't try to fill the silence with questions or conversation, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. He'd had enough people filling silence at him in the past 2 years. After about 10 minutes, she said, "Tell me about the spring." He looked at her sideways. "What spring?" "The one that's drying up." "You didn't put it in the advertisement." "But you're a rancher with 90 cattle, and if your water was reliable, you wouldn't need someone else's labor this badly." He told her about the spring. It had been reliable for 18 years, his father's time and his own. It served the house, the cattle, the kitchen garden. 8 months ago, it had started dropping. Now it was a quarter of what it had been. He was hauling water twice a week, which with his hands was he stopped, started again, which was difficult. Mara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Has anyone dug it out? Checked for blockage?" "First thing I tried. And clean. Nothing blocking it. Water just isn't coming." She was quiet for another quarter mile. "Whose land is upstream from you?" Silas felt something move in his chest. The question was too specific to be casual. Why? "Because springs don't just stop," she said. "Not good ones. Not after 18 years. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the flat winterland, the gray sky sitting on top of it like a lid. Something changed upstream. Something redirected where the water's going. "Vernon Pike owns the land upstream," Silas said. She didn't react to the name, which meant she didn't know it yet. She would. "What's he been building up there?" she asked. "Drainage ditches. For the new development lots he's selling." Silas paused. "His company dug through a gravel ridge about a year ago." Mara was quiet for a long time after that. Red Willow Ranch announced itself before you could see it properly, the smell of livestock, the particular absence of trees that meant open working land, and then the shape of the outbuildings against the gray sky, utilitarian and weathered, the way buildings get when they've been standing up to weather for a long time without anyone having the resources to do more than keep them standing. Calder was in the yard when they pulled in. He saw the wagon, saw his father, and then saw the woman on the seat beside him, and his face did something complicated that Silas recognized because he'd felt the same sequence himself that morning in front of the chest, moving the shawl. The boy walked toward them with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing its usual set thing. "This isn't Miss Beecham," Calder said. "No," Silas said. "Where's Miss Beecham? Married someone else." Calder processed this. He looked at Mara with the unfiltered assessment of an 11-year-old who had decided somewhere in the last 2 years that the world owed him honesty at minimum. "Then who's she?" he asked. "Mara Veldt," Mara said before Silas could answer. "I'm a blacksmith. I'm going to look at your forge, if that's all right with you." Calder stared at her. "Our forge doesn't work. That's why I'm going to look at it," she said. Something moved in the boy's face. Not warmth exactly, but the faint, grudging acknowledgement of someone who has given a reasonable answer. He looked at the tool chest in the back of the wagon. "That's a lot of tools," he said. "Yes," said Mara. "For a woman," he said. There was a pause. "Yes," said Mara again, with exactly the same inflection. Calder looked at his father, who was very carefully not looking at either of them. Then the boy went and put his hands on one end of the tool chest and helped bring it down from the wagon without being asked. Mara slept in the room off the kitchen, which had been a storage room, and then nothing in particular and was now, Silas told her, hers for as long as the arrangement lasted. He said it awkwardly, because there was no arrangement yet, only a conversation on a train platform and a shared tool chest and 40 minutes of silence that had somehow been more comfortable than it had any right to be. She put her bag down. She looked at the window, which had a gap at the upper left corner, where the frame had warped. She ran one thumb along the gap, checking its size, and then went and found a strip of old leather in the bottom of her chest and wedged it in. The draft stopped. That was the first thing she fixed at Red Willow Ranch. The second thing was harder. That evening, after supper, Maisie appeared in the doorway of the storage room holding the doll. She didn't say anything. She was 6 and missing her mother in the specific total way of a 6-year-old who has had to learn too early that some things don't come back. She just held the doll out. The arm was broken at the joint. The porcelain cracked in a way that someone had already tried to glue and failed at, which meant someone had tried and felt bad about failing. Mara could see the dried glue lines from Silas's attempts. She took the doll. She looked at it carefully. She turned it over. "Sit with me while I fix it," she said. "I need someone to hold the arm still." Maisie came in and sat. She held the arm still. And in the light of the single lamp in that storage room, with the gap in the window sealed against the wind, Mara Veldt worked on a child's doll with the same focused attention she'd have given a broken plow blade, because broken is broken, and some things deserve to be fixed regardless of size. Maisie fell asleep in the chair before the glue had finished setting. Silas found them like that when he came to say goodnight. His daughter asleep, Mara sitting beside her, waiting for the repair to hold, not moving because moving might disturb what was still setting. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't say anything. She looked up at him and her expression said, "I know." "Don't make it into something." He nodded very slightly and went to bed. The forge was worse than she'd let on to Calder. She spent the whole of the next morning on it, and the assessment was grim. The firebox lining had cracked through in 3 places. The bellows leather had dried and crumbled, and the flue was partially blocked by 11 years of debris. The anvil itself was fine. A good anvil takes serious neglect to ruin, but the tuyere was cracked, which was the kind of problem that could cost her most of the day just to address. She didn't tell Silas any of this in the language of problems. She told him what she needed, specific materials, specific dimensions. He brought them. She worked. Calder appeared at noon and stood in the doorway of the forge building for 20 minutes before she acknowledged him. "You going to watch or help?" she said, without looking up from the tuyere. Silence, then help. She handed him a chisel and showed him what to do with it. He did it wrong twice and right on the 3rd attempt. "Better," she said. He didn't smile, but his jaw unclenched slightly. By late afternoon, the forge was breathing again. The first fire was small and uncertain, the way any first fire is, and the smoke came wrong initially because the flue needed more clearing, and Mara had Calder up on the roof with a rod before either of them fully registered that was an odd task to give an 11-year-old. He did it without complaint. When the smoke went straight and clean, Mara stood back and looked at the fire. "There," she said. "It wasn't a celebration. It was just a statement of fact, the way a builder says there when the last board goes in." But Calder was watching the fire with the particular attention of someone who has just seen something he didn't believe could happen. "It actually works," he said. "It works," she agreed. "My dad's been trying to get that thing running for. Your dad has other things to manage," she said, not unkindly, cutting off wherever that sentence was going. Calder looked at her. He was an 11-year-old with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and he was working out in real time what to do with this woman who had appeared without invitation and was fixing things his family had stopped believing could be fixed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't even live here." Mara looked at the fire. "Everybody lives somewhere," she said. "Right now I live here." He didn't have an answer for that. After a moment, he went and found the bellows rod and started to work it the way she'd shown him. She let him. 3 days after the forge came back to life, the first farmer arrived. He came awkwardly, hat in hand, the way men come when they need something and aren't sure they have the right to need it. His name was Aldous Crane, and he had a blade that had broken 2 seasons ago, and he'd been managing without it, which in Dakota terms meant he'd been slowly losing ground. Mara looked at the blade for 4 seconds. "Leave it," she said. "Come back tomorrow afternoon." He came back. The blade was repaired, not just joined back together, but reinforced along the crack line so that the repair was stronger than the original metal. He held it and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the look of a person re-evaluating. "What do I owe you?" he said. She named a fair price. He paid it, and when he got back to his farm, he told his neighbor. The neighbor told 2 more. By the end of the 2nd week, Mara had more work than daylight. She didn't complain about this. She organized it. Mornings were for the forge. Afternoons for repairs that needed the machinery. Evenings she studied Silas's ranch records, the layout of the land, the upstream geography she'd been building in her head since the conversation in the wagon. Something about that spring wouldn't let her alone. Not the fact of it drying up, the timing. One night, late, when the house was quiet, she spread the county survey maps on the kitchen table and went through them with the specific focus of someone who is no longer asking whether something happened but how. She found it at midnight, the gravel ridge. Pike's drainage cuts. The direction of water flow through underground gravel beds, which doesn't move the way surface water moves, it moves slowly, sideways. Following paths created millions of years ago that have nothing to do with modern property lines or development plans. The spring hadn't failed. The spring had been redirected. And if she was reading these maps correctly, if the gravel formation ran the way it appeared to the water that fed Red Willow Ranch for 18 years, was now feeding Vernon Pike's drainage system instead. She sat with that for a long time in the cold kitchen. Then she folded the maps, put them back, and went to bed. She didn't say anything to Silas that night. She needed to be certain first. She needed to look at the ground. She needed to understand exactly what she'd found before she told a man whose life had been slowly dismantled that the dismantling wasn't an accident. Some things you don't say until you know you can do something about them. She went out to the spring the next morning before anyone else was awake. The ground was hard, and the sky was the particular shade of gray that meant the cold intended to stay. She brought a short-handled spade and the county survey map folded into her coat pocket, and she walked the half-mile from the house to where the spring emerged or had emerged, before it became this thin, apologetic thread of water barely covering the flat stones at its mouth. She'd been thinking about it for 3 days. Not obsessively, not in the way that keeps you from sleeping, but steadily, the way you think about a repair job that's more complicated than it first appeared. You turn it over. You consider it from different angles. You come back to it when your hands are busy doing something else, and your mind is free to work without pressure. Now she crouched at the edge of the spring basin and dug. Not deep, just enough to see the composition of the gravel bed underneath, the way the stone was layered, the direction it naturally sloped. She dug in 4 places, moving along the spring line, and what she found confirmed what the map had suggested. The gravel formation here was part of a larger underground bed, a slow-moving reservoir that collected snowmelt and deep rain over decades, filtered it clean through 50 feet of stone, and released it at predictable pressure. It was the kind of water source that didn't fail unless something upstream interfered with the collection. She found the blasted gravel on the 3rd dig. Sharp-edged fragments, the kind you only get from deliberate cutting, not the smooth river gravel that had always been here. Someone had driven equipment through the formation upstream, and the disruption had sent a portion of that gravel down through the flow path. Not enough to block it outright, just enough to redirect it. The kind of change that could look, to anyone not digging with a specific question in mind, like natural decline. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at what was in her hand. Then she put the gravel in her coat pocket, filled the holes back in, and walked back to the house. She didn't say anything to Silas over breakfast. She watched him manage his coffee mug with the particular care he'd developed both hands, the grip compensating for what the fingers couldn't do, and she watched Calder eat with his eyes on his plate. and Maisie knock over her cup of milk and go absolutely still waiting for a reaction that didn't come because Silas simply got up and cleaned it without comment. The patient, exhausted reflex of a man who'd stopped having the energy to make small things into moments. She needed to know more before she spoke. Specifically, she needed to know whether what she suspected about Pike's drainage work was provable or just plausible. And there was a significant gap between those two things when you were talking about accusing a man who owned more property than any 5 ranchers combined. After breakfast, she found Silas in the barn and said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer straight." He looked at her over the back of a horse he was brushing. "All right, Vernon Pike, what exactly did he build upstream last year?" Not the general answer. The specific one. Silas set down the brush. He had the look of a man who'd been waiting for a question he didn't want to answer. Drainage channel, 1/4 mile of it, running west from the ridge. His company cut through the gravel formation to lay it. Did anyone survey it before they cut? Pike had his own surveyor. County inspect the work? A long pause. Pike sits on the county water board, Silas said. Mara looked at him. Has sat on it for 6 years, he added. She reached into her coat pocket and held out the sharp-edged gravel she'd pulled from the spring basin. He took it and looked at it the way she'd hoped he would, not like a man seeing gravel, but like a man who'd spent his whole life working land and understood immediately that this kind of edge didn't belong where it had been found. That came from your spring bed, she said, 30 yards downstream from where his drainage cut ended. Silas held it a moment longer. Then he put it down on the top of the stall gate very carefully, like something that needed to be kept separate from ordinary objects. If I try to bring this to the county water board, he said, Pike will be sitting at the table. I know, and if I try to bring it to a lawyer, I need money for a lawyer, which I know, she said again. He looked at her, not with hope exactly. With the measuring look of a man who has been disappointed enough times to be careful with hope, but not so many times that he's stopped being capable of it. Then why are you telling me? Because knowing is better than not knowing, she said. Even when it makes things harder. She took the gravel back from the gate. And because I'm not done looking yet. She wasn't. But she needed something else first. She needed to understand the full extent of the underground water formation. Which meant she needed someone who knew the local geology better than a county survey map could tell her. And the only person she'd heard mentioned in that context was an old homesteader named Erwin Lusk, who had lived on the eastern edge of the county for 30 years and was said to have dug more wells by hand than any man in the territory. She asked Silas about him that evening. Lusk, Silas said, and his expression did something complicated. He's cantankerous as a wet cat, and he hasn't spoken to anyone from this end of the county since a property dispute in '84. With you? With my father. Over a fence line. Is the dispute settled? My father's dead, so, Silas shrugged. In a technical sense. Then I'll go see him, Mara said. He won't talk to you. He might, she said. He doesn't know me. She rode out the next morning. The Lusk property was 8 miles east, and the road was bad, and the temperature had dropped another few degrees overnight, which in Dakota in November meant it was simply doing what it had promised. She arrived to find an old man splitting wood in his yard, with the efficient, joyless focus of someone who has long since stopped expecting the day to offer anything better than the task directly in front of him. Erwin Lusk was 70 or close to it, built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work and hadn't softened any of it with comfort. He looked at her the way he probably looked at most things, with the comprehensive suspicion of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors generally wanted something he wasn't willing to give. I'm Mara Veldt, she said, still on the horse. I'm staying at Red Willow Ranch. Rourke's place, he said. Not a question. Not friendly. You his new wife? She'd been at the ranch for 2 weeks by then, and the question of what exactly she was had become a topic of interest to people she'd never met, which was the particular texture of small community attention that she'd grown up understanding and didn't enjoy. I'm his blacksmith, she said. Lusk squinted at her. His blacksmith. Yes, he seemed to find this more acceptable than whatever he'd been prepared for. He went back to splitting wood. What do you want? She told him. Not everything, not the accusation, not the gravel, not the full shape of what she suspected. Just the geology. She told him she was trying to understand the underground water formations in the county, and she'd heard he dug more wells here than anyone else alive, and she wanted to know if he'd be willing to share what he'd learned over 30 years. He split 4 pieces of wood while she talked. When she finished, he split 2 more. The gravel formation runs northeast to southwest, he said, without looking up. Starts up at the ridge, comes down under about 60% of the county. Pressurized in spots, has been since before any of us got here. He set up another log. Rourke's father hit it once, digging a test well, 20-some years ago. Said it came up strong. What stopped him from drilling properly? Money. Same thing that stops everything. He split the log. Pike bought the ridge land 4 years ago. Always seemed like a peculiar purchase for a man interested in town property. He looked at her then for the first time since she'd started talking. You find something in that spring, did you? She didn't answer directly. I found something I'm still thinking about. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. Girl comes 8 miles in November to ask me about geology and won't tell me what she found. He picked up another log. Rourke's father was a straight man. Can't say the same for the fence line, but straight as a person. He paused. The sun is straight? Straighter, she said. Lusk split the log. Come inside. I'll show you the maps I drew. His maps were better than the county survey. Not professionally produced, just hand-drawn on large sheets of butcher paper, accumulated over decades of digging wells for himself and neighbors and anyone else who'd paid or bartered for the work. He'd recorded every formation, every depth, every place where the gravel bed showed pressure. They were the maps of a man who had paid close attention to one piece of earth for a very long time. She sat at his table for 2 hours. He was not warm. He was not conversational, but he answered every question she put to him with the direct accuracy of someone who respected competence enough to meet it honestly. When she left, she knew 3 things she hadn't known when she arrived. The first was that the underground aquifer was substantially larger than she'd estimated. It ran beneath not just Red Willow Ranch, but most of the central county under dozens of properties. The second was that the aquifer was pressurized. Under the right conditions, with the right equipment, it could be accessed from below through a driven pipe well rather than a dug well. You wouldn't need to dig 60 feet by hand. You'd need to drive pipe down, and if you hit the formation correctly, the water would come up on its own. The third thing was that Vernon Pike had hired a geological surveyor 9 months ago. Lusk knew because the surveyor had come to talk to him, same as Mara. Same questions, and unlike Mara, he'd had a company name on his card. Pike already knew about the aquifer, which meant Pike knew what he was sitting on when he bought that ridgeland, which meant the drainage cuts, the gravel displacement, the dried spring. It was possible. It was more than possible that none of it was accidental. She rode back to Red Willow Ranch in the dark, with the cold biting through the coat she'd thought was warm enough, and Lusk's maps rolled and tucked inside it against her chest. She didn't go straight inside when she arrived. She stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the forge building, where the faint orange glow through the window seam meant Calder had gone in there on his own. She'd found him doing that twice now, going to the forge in the evening, when the day's official work was done, practicing the small exercises she'd shown him, getting the feel for the tools. He hadn't asked her permission and she hadn't mentioned it, and that was an arrangement she found she didn't want to disturb. She went inside and found Silas at the kitchen table. He was not doing anything. He was just sitting there with his hands in front of him, which she had come to understand was not idleness but a particular kind of exhaustion that happens to a person when they've been fighting something for so long that the body knows test when the opportunity exists, even if the mind hasn't agreed. She sat across from him and spread Lusk's maps on the table, told him everything, the gravel, the formation, the aquifer, Pike's surveyor. What it meant that a man who already knew about the pressurized water underground had then purchased the ridge that controlled the recharge zone, had then run drainage cuts through the formation, had then waited while the springs on surrounding properties began to decline. Silas listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she'd noticed about him. Early, he didn't interrupt. He waited until you were finished, and then he thought about it, actually thought, not the performance of thinking, while you prepared your own response. When she finished, he looked at the maps for a long time. He's been cutting off the surface water, he said slowly, while buying up the underground source. That's what I think, so that when the springs fail and the ranchers can't sustain their herds, they sell at a loss. And he already owns the only reliable water in the county, Mara said. Yes, Silas sat back. The lamp between them put half his face in shadow. That's a long game for a land developer. It's a very profitable game, she said. If it works. He looked at her. You think you can stop it? She didn't answer immediately, because she wasn't going to give him an easy yes she wasn't sure she could keep. I think I know something he doesn't know we know, she said. And I think there's something that can be done with the aquifer that might change the whole shape of the problem. She put her finger on Lusk's map, on the notation he'd made about the pressurized formation, a driven well. If the pressure is what Lusk says it is, you don't need to dig to reach this water. You drive pipe down into the formation and it comes up by itself. I've heard of driven wells, Silas said carefully. Never seen one that worked. My father built one, she said. Outside of Pittsburgh 22 years ago. He kept the plans. She stopped. Then, I have them. In the chest. He looked at her in the particular way people look when they've just realized something about someone they thought they were beginning to understand. You came out here with plans for a driven well. I came out here with everything my father left me when he died, she said, which was more honest than she'd intended to be. The plans were in the chest with everything else. I didn't think about them until I found Lusk's maps. That was mostly true. Even if you could build it, Silas said, Pike will find out. He'll move against us before it's done. Probably, she said. That's the part I haven't solved yet. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove made small settling sounds. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing something to a loose board on the south side of the house that produced a rhythmic, low complaint. You know what people are saying about you, he said finally. Not accusatory, just stating a fact that was in the room. In town. She knew. The station master's wife had made sure the knowing spread efficiently. An unmarried woman living with a widower, no formal arrangement, no obvious explanation that fit any category the county was prepared to offer. The gossip had reached her through Aldous Crane's wife, who'd delivered it with a sympathy that was almost genuine. I know what they're saying. It's going to get worse, Silas said. If Pike realizes you're asking questions about the water, he'll use it. He's done it before with other people, not the water part, but finding something and using it. I know, she said again. Mara. He said her name with a specific weight, not the weight of a man about to give an order or make a speech, but the weight of a man who is about to say something that costs him something. I can't ask you to stay here and take on what this is going to become. You came to deliver a letter. You fixed my forge. That's more than. I didn't fix your forge so I could leave, she said. He stopped. I fixed it because it needed fixing, she said. Same reason I'm sitting here with these maps at 9 o'clock at night. She rolled Lusk's maps back up. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I want to be clear about that. I've met men who need to be pitied, and you're not one of them. You're a man dealing with a run of genuinely bad luck that has been made worse by a genuinely bad person, and there might be something to do about it. And I would like to do it. She looked at him, but I can't do it from a storage room. Not if the gossip is going to be used as a weapon. Silas was very still. What are you saying? He said. She had thought about how to say this for 3 days, which was unlike her. She was not generally a person who refined her words before she used them. But this one required getting right. I'm saying that if we get married, the gossip stops having any teeth. I'm saying that married, I have standing to operate the forge as a business under this property without anyone being able to challenge it. I'm saying that your fight with Pike becomes something we fight together instead of separately. She paused. I'm also saying that I'm not Margaret. I'm not trying to be. I don't expect anything from this that you're not able to give. The silence after that was very long. You're proposing to me, Silas said. Yes, you've been here 3 weeks. I'm aware. He looked at his hands on the table. She watched him look at them, not the self-pity look, but the accounting look. The look of a man trying to honestly assess what he had to offer and whether it was enough to justify saying yes to something that required another person to take a significant risk. "My hands aren't going to get better," he said. "I know that." Calder, as he stopped, started again. "He's not easy. He's been angry for 2 years, and he might be angry for 2 more. He's 11 and his mother died," she said. "He's allowed. Maisie still cries at night sometimes. She doesn't think I can hear her." "I know." He looked up. "You know? Her room is next to mine," she said. He absorbed this. "And you didn't. I left her to it," she said. "She's not crying because something is wrong. She's crying because she misses her mother. Those are different things, and they require different responses." Silas was quiet for a very long time after that. Long enough that the stove settled twice and the wind found a new complaint in a different board. "I should tell you," he said finally, "that I don't know if I'm capable of." He stopped again, and she could see him working through it. The specific difficulty of a private man trying to be honest about something he hadn't said out loud. "I cared for Margaret, I did. And when she died, I thought that part was finished for me. I'm not sure it's finished, but I don't know if it's minus." "Silas," she said, "I'm not asking you to love me." He looked at her. "I'm asking you to marry me," she said. "Those are different things, too." He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, but had some of the same release in it. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll think about it. Or all right, you will." "All right, I will," he said. She nodded. She got up and put the maps in her coat and went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark, which was something she needed to do privately after a decision of that size, and she thought about her father's forge in Pittsburgh, and the well plans rolled in his handwriting, and the way a good plan looked very simple on paper and very complicated once you introduced the actual variables of terrain and weather and the will of other people. She thought about the gravel in her coat pocket. She thought about Pike's flat eyes and the description Silas had given her. She hadn't met the man yet, but she'd learned enough from enough sources to have a reasonable picture the patience of someone who moves slowly because he can afford to, because he believes no one else can afford to wait him out. She thought, "We'll see." Then she lay down and went to sleep. The wedding was 4 days later, in the county clerk's office, with Aldous Crane and his wife as witnesses, because they were the people most likely to tell everyone immediately, which was practically the point. Calder stood in the corner of the office with his hands in his pockets and the jaw doing its set thing, which Mara had come to read as his version of paying attention. Maisie held the repaired doll and watched the proceedings with the solemnity of someone who understood something significant was happening, even if the exact implications were unclear. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Calder fell in beside Mara. "Does this mean you're staying?" he said. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Long enough to matter, I hope." He thought about this. "My mother used to say that thing about mattering. She sounds like she was a smart woman." She was. He was quiet for a half block, then, "You're not like her." "No," Mara agreed. "I'm not saying that like it's bad," he said, in the careful tone of an 11-year-old who has realized the sentence required clarification. "I know," she said. He put his hands back in his pockets. "I want to learn the tongs grip, the one you showed me but I keep losing control of. We'll work on it tonight," she said. He nodded, and that, for Calder Rourke, was approximately the equivalent of a declaration of acceptance. The forge work expanded the week after the wedding with a speed that surprised even Mara. Farmers who'd been watching cautiously from a distance, partly because of the gossip, partly because they couldn't quite credit that a woman blacksmith was the real thing, now arrived steadily. Word of the plow repair had moved through the community the way practical news moves, mouth to mouth, attached to evidence. The blade worked better than it had before it broke. That was the kind of testimony that meant more than any advertisement. She handled each job herself until the volume made that impossible, and then she began showing Calder the simpler work, the consistent, repetitive repairs that required control more than strength. He was good at it in the way naturally methodical people are good at things, not flashy, but reliable. He made fewer mistakes than she'd expected and absorbed correction without the sulking that some boys his age used as armor. She also, during this same period, began modifying Silas's tools. She did this without announcing it. She simply observed him the way he managed the pitchfork, the specific compensations he made for the failure in his grip, and she thought about it the way she thought about any engineering problem, which was to ask, what is the actual task? And what stands between the person and the task? The grip was gone. But the forearm worked. The shoulder worked. The intent worked. The first piece she made for him was a leather brace with an iron reinforcement that wrapped the forearm and extended to a modified handle grip, not replacing what he couldn't do, but routing the force through what he could. She left it on the workbench in the barn without comment. He found it 2 days later. He came to the forge that evening and stood in the doorway. It was working, and she didn't stop, and she didn't look up. "You made this," he said. "Yes," without measuring my arm. "I watched you long enough," she said. "Try it tomorrow on something real. Tell me what's wrong with it, and I'll adjust." 2 days after that, he came back to the forge. She looked up this time. "I pitched the east section," he said. He meant he'd pitched hay, which he hadn't been able to do, not fully, not without help, in almost 3 years. He was not a man who made speeches about things. He just looked at her for a moment with something open in his face that she hadn't seen there before, something under the ordinary exhaustion of his days that was maybe the first evidence of a thing beginning to come back. "What needs adjusting?" she said. "The pressure on the fourth finger," he said. "Goes numb after about 20 minutes. Come in," she said. "Let me look at it." He came in, and she adjusted the brace at the forge while it was warm enough to reshape. And he stood close while she worked because she needed his hand right there. And neither of them said anything else about the hay or the 3 years or the expression that had been on his face in the doorway. But it was there. She'd seen it, and she thought he knew she'd seen it. Some things don't need to be said to be real. Outside, the temperature was still falling. It was mid-November now, and the sky had the look it gets before serious snow, not threatening exactly, just committed. The cattle needed more water than the diminished spring could provide. Silas was hauling twice a week, and it was costing him time, and the specific toll that repeated physical work takes on hands already operating beyond their capacity. And Vernon Pike had been quiet. That was the thing that stayed with Mara during the work, at the back of her mind where she kept things she hadn't solved yet. Pike had been quiet since before she arrived, patient and quiet, and a man who had spent a year building a scheme this methodical did not go quiet by accident. He was waiting for something. She needed to know what. She found out on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, when Aldous Crane arrived at the forge before breakfast with the specific tight-faced look of a man delivering bad news he didn't entirely understand. Pike bought the Henderson parcel, he said. Mara was banking the forge fire, and she stopped. The Henderson parcel was the narrow strip of land between Red Willow Ranch and the creek, the emergency water access that Silas used when the spring was too low. It was a 20-acre strip that old Martin Henderson had owned for 15 years and had twice refused to sell to anyone. "When?" she said. "Papers filed yesterday," Crane said. "Henderson's boy came to tell me this morning. Said his father held out long as he could, but Pike offered 3 times market value and told him the offer expired in 48 hours. Put down the iron she was holding. "He's going to fence it," she said. Crane nodded. "That's what the boy," said Pike, told his father. Said he planned to fence the full perimeter for a development project. Mara looked at the fire for a moment. The fire looked back at her with its ordinary indifference. "How long before the fence goes up?" she said. "Week. Maybe 10 days, depending on the ground. 10 days. In 10 days, if Pike fenced the creek access and the spring continued its decline, Silas's cattle would have no reliable water source within working distance. In Dakota in November, with temperatures already approaching 20 below at night and still dropping, dehydrated cattle didn't last long. Pike knew this. He had timed it to the weather the way a careful man times everything. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to tell me." "What are you going to do?" Crane said. She looked at him. "Something I haven't entirely figured out yet," she said. "But I'll figure it out." After he left, she went to the chest. She hadn't opened the bottom section since arriving. She'd worked from the top 3 trays, the tools, the repair materials, the everyday equipment of a working blacksmith. The bottom section was different. It held the things she'd brought because they were her father's, not because she had an immediate use for them. She lifted out the leather folio and opened it on the workbench. Her father's handwriting. The driven well plans he'd drawn over the course of 2 years of experimenting, trying, failing, trying again, and finally succeeding in a way that he'd said, in the letter he'd tucked inside the folio, would work for anyone who was patient and willing to learn from the specific mistakes he'd documented in the margin notes. She spread the plans open and looked at them in the forge light. Then she sat down on the 3-legged stool and started doing the math she should have done 2 weeks ago. 60 feet of iron pipe minimum, steel dravine point which she could forge. Cottonwood poles for the driving rig which were available. The driving weight, the fitting work, the seal, all of that she could manage. The pipe was the problem. 60 feet of iron pipe in the right diameter. In November, in Crooked Creek, was not something you could acquire in a week with the money Red Willow Ranch currently had. She looked at the plans. She looked at her tools. She looked at the bottom of the chest where her father's drawings sat. She thought about what she had and what it was worth and whether she was willing. She already knew the answer, but she gave herself the evening to make sure. By morning, she was sure. She harnessed the horse, loaded the chest into the wagon, and went to find Silas before she left. He was in the barn. He looked at the loaded wagon, and then at her face. "Where are you going?" he said. "Railroad shops," she said. "East Yard. 2 days, maybe 3. He looked at the chest in the back of the wagon. He understood immediately what it meant that it was back there, because he'd seen what was in it, and he knew she'd take her tools before almost anything else. "Mara," he said. "I'll be back," she said. "I'm not worried about that," he said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. He stopped. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to work," she said. "For whatever they need at the railroad shops, I'm going to work until they give me pipe in trade." He stared at her. "It's the only thing I have that's worth 60 feet of pipe," she said. "My labor. You could sell it." "No," she said. "I can't." He understood. He'd seen the folio. He knew what was in that chest beyond tools. He looked at the wagon. He looked at her. He had that expression again, the open one, the one she'd seen in the forge doorway after he'd pitched the hay, the one she hadn't seen on his face the day she'd arrived. "Come back," he said. It was not quite a question. "I told you I would," she said. She picked up the reins. The road east was cold and long, and the horse didn't appreciate the wind any more than she did, and by the time the railroad yard came into view in the gray afternoon light, her hands were numb inside her gloves, and she was running through the plan again, not because she was uncertain, but because detail work is what keeps you sane when you're doing something that scares you a little. She drove through the yard gate and found the foreman. She told him what she could do. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific skepticism of a man who has heard a lot of claims and learned to discount most of them. "Show me," he said. She showed him. The railroad foreman's name was Gus Petrie, and he was not a man who gave anything away easily. He was maybe 50, built like someone who'd spent the first 30 years of his life doing the work himself before graduating to watching other people do it. And he had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having seen enough bad work to stop being surprised by it. He watched Mara set up at the spare forge in the east maintenance shed, with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing in particular. And he didn't speak, and he didn't move, and he waited. She didn't perform for him. That was the thing she'd learned early when someone is deciding whether to trust your competence. Performing competence is the worst thing you can do, because performance is visible and visibility is doubt. She just worked. She took the damaged couple pile that was sitting on the scrap pile near the door she'd spotted it when she came in, a broken flange fitting that someone had set aside as unworkable, and she assessed it for about 45 seconds, and then she began. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. The repair required 3 separate heating sequences and a technique for redrawing the flange edge that she'd worked out over years of dealing with exactly this category of break, where the metal had fatigued unevenly and a straight repair would just crack again at the junction. She built the repair to outlast the original piece. When she set it down on the bench and stepped back, Petrie came over and picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He ran his thumb along the join line. He put it against the fitting template on the wall to check the dimensions. He set it down. "What do you want?" he said. 60 feet of iron pipe, she said. 2-inch diameter, and the drilling collar fittings to match. He looked at her. "That's not scrap pipe, that's stock." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm not asking for it free. I'm asking to work for it. How long do you think 60 feet of pipe and stock is worth?" "At labor rates for a journeyman smith, about 4 days," she said. "At what I can actually produce in 4 days, probably less." She met his eyes. "You've got 2 locomotives on the far track with superheater tube fittings that have been sitting tagged for repair for at least 3 weeks based on the rust on the tags. I can see 4 more jobs from where I'm standing that your current crew either doesn't have the time or the specialty to handle. Give me access to the forge and 4 days in the pipe, and we're square." Petrie looked at the coupling she'd repaired. He looked at the far track. He looked back at her. "You sleep in the tool room," he said. "There's a cot. That's fine," she said. "You start at 6. "I started at 6 today," she said. "That's not a condition. That's just when I work." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. 4 days, he said. "We square up on the last evening." She worked 4 days at the railroad yard, and she did not sleep much, and she did not think about much, except the work directly in front of her, which was her method for managing situations where thinking too broadly led nowhere useful. The superheater tube fittings took most of the first day. The second day, she handled 6 separate repair jobs that Petrie brought her, each one logged and assessed. Nothing she couldn't manage, but nothing trivial either. By the end of the third day, she was aware that several of the yard crew had begun drifting near the maintenance shed on their breaks and watching without pretending they weren't, which she accepted as a reasonable response to something unfamiliar. On the evening of the 4th day, Petrie came in while she was banking the fire. "You know," he said, "I had a woman asked to work here once before." "What happened?" she said without turning around. "Sent her away," he said. "Foreman before me. Different time." He picked up one of the finished fittings from the day's work and turned it in his hands. He wasn't entirely wrong about the complications, but he was wrong about the reason. She turned around. He set the fitting down. "Pipe's loaded on your wagon," he said. 62 feet. "I put the extra 2 in because the end section has a slight variation in the draw, and you'll want to cut your working end from stock you can rely on." He paused. "Collar fittings are in a box under the tarp." "Thank you," she said. "Your chest is in there too," he said. "I had my boys help load it." She nodded. She was tired in a way that went past her hands and her arms and sat somewhere behind her eyes. But it was the clean tired of finished work, the kind you can sleep through rather than the kind that keeps you awake. "One more thing," Petrie said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "That fitting you repaired on the first day, the flange coupling. Foreman from the northern line was in yesterday for a parts order, and I showed it to him. He set the paper on the bench. That's his card. He says if you want contract work seasonal, no obligation, they've got maintenance needs every spring and fall that their current supplier isn't handling well." Mara looked at the card. She didn't pick it up yet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because good work deserves to go somewhere," Petrie said. He sounded slightly annoyed. The way people sound when they've done something generous and feel mildly embarrassed about it. Take the card or don't. She took the card. She drove back to Red Willow Ranch through the night and into the early morning, stopping once to water the horse and eat the bread she'd brought and let the silence of the empty road do what silence does when you've been in noise and heat and close company for 4 days. The pipe was heavy in the wagon behind her. She could hear it shift occasionally on the turns, a low metallic sound that was not unpleasant. She arrived at first light. Silas was already in the yard. He saw the wagon, and then he saw the pipe under the tarp, and then he saw her face, and he came and took the reins from her hands and tied the horse himself without saying anything for a moment. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I slept," she said. Some he looked at the wagon. "You kept the chest." "I told you I wasn't selling it." "I know," he said. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood what was in it. Relief, and something more personal than relief, and the slight self-consciousness of a man who hadn't expected to feel either. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." His coffee was worse than hers, which she'd been too polite to say directly, but which Calder had said with complete honesty 3 days after she arrived. This morning she drank it without comment because it was hot and she was cold, and some things matter more than quality. She told him about Petrie's offer while she drank it. The Northern Line contract. He listened with the focused attention he always gave to practical information and then said, "That's good. That's genuinely good." And she could hear in his voice that he meant it not just for the money, but for what it meant about the work that someone outside Crooked Creek had seen it and recognized it. "How much time do we have?" she said. "On the fence?" He set his mug down. "Crane came by yesterday. Pike's crew was on the Henderson land the day before, setting posts. So a week, maybe less, he said. She thought about the plans. She'd been thinking about them for 4 days whenever she had a free corner of her mind. The driven well process was not complicated in principle. Drive pipe into the earth, hit pressurized water, let physics do the work. But the details of it were where things went wrong. The driving had to be steady and controlled, not forceful and enthusiastic, which was a distinction that was very hard to communicate to men who were accustomed to solving resistance problems with more force. The angle had to be precise. And the gravel formation, according to Lusk's maps, was at approximately 58 to 60 feet down, which meant the work was almost entirely blind. You were driving towards something you couldn't see, trusting the maps and the geology and the math. "I need Lusk," she said. Silas looked at her. "He won't come." "He might," she said. "He came inside to show me his maps." "That's different from coming to Rourke land after 20 years of a fence dispute." "The fence dispute was with your father," she said. "Your father is dead. You're not your father. I know that." "Does Lusk know that?" Silas was quiet. "I'll go this afternoon," she said. "After I sleep for 3 hours." She slept for 3 hours and 20 minutes, which was approximately what her body needed, and not a minute more, a fact she'd always found slightly annoying about herself. Then she washed her face, checked the wagon was still properly loaded, and rode east. Lusk was in his workshop this time, not the yard. She knocked, and he said something that might have been "come in," and she did. He looked up from whatever he was working on and said, "Back again." "I need you to come to Red Willow Ranch," she said. "No," he said. "I have 62 feet of iron pipe and my father's driven well plans, and approximately 1 week before Vernon Pike fences the last surface water access to that property," she said. "I need someone who knows where exactly that formation lies, who can stand there with me while we drive and tell me if we're going off angle. I haven't been on Rourke land since Silas Rourke is not his father," she said. "Whatever the fence dispute was, it was between 2 men who are both dead, and it has nothing to do with the water that's under that land or the 2 children who live there or the 89 cattle that are going to start dying in a month if we don't find a way to water them." Lusk looked at her for a long time. 89, he said. Advertisement said 90. "One of the older cows didn't make it through October," she said. The water stress. He set down his work. He picked it back up. He set it down again. "The fence dispute," he said, "was about 40 yards of land that your husband's father took from me in a survey that I believe to this day was fraudulent." "I believe you," she said. He looked at her sharply, as if expecting argument and finding the absence of it more difficult to handle. "I'm not saying Silas Rourke owes you nothing," she said. "I'm saying that's a separate conversation from whether 90 cattle die this winter and whether Vernon Pike gets to own every water source in this county by spring." She let that sit for a moment. "Come help me drill the well. After, if you want to talk to Silas about the 40 yards, I'll make sure that conversation happens." Lusk was silent for a very long time. "I'll want to see those plans of your father's," he said finally. "You can see them when you get there," she said. He made a sound in the back of his throat that was not agreement and not refusal, but something navigating between them. "I'll come tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. Early is fine," she said. "I'll have the forge going." He came at 5:30, which was earlier than early by most standards. And he came with his own equipment, a set of depth gauges he'd made himself over years of well digging, calibrated to the specific density of the local gravel formation in a way no manufactured instrument could match. He spread her father's plans on the kitchen table without greeting anyone, studied them for 20 minutes in complete silence, and then said, "Your father was a careful man." He was, she said. These margin notes. He pointed to the small, dense handwriting her father had added after each experimental attempt, the failures documented as specifically as the successes. Most men don't write down what went wrong. He said the failures were more useful than the successes, she said, because you only succeed one way, but you can fail 100 ways, and knowing tells you more. Lusk looked at her, then he looked back at the plans. "All right," he said, "show me where you want to drive." She had already chosen the site. She'd walked it twice in the past 2 days, using Lusk's formation maps and the survey of the land, and a hand level she'd rigged from a piece of water tube and a brass fitting, checking the ground slope and the probable depth at 3 different locations. The best site was 40 yards east of the dry spring, on a slight rise that Lusk's map suggested sat directly above the main flow path of the pressurized aquifer. Lusk walked the site with her. He used his depth gauges, pushing the probes into the ground at intervals and reading them with the practiced familiarity of someone reading a language he'd spent 30 years learning. He was quiet for a long time. "Here," he said finally, and put his boot heel on a spot 2 yards north of where she'd marked. "Your maps put the formation slightly south of that," she said. "My maps are from the surface," he said. "The probes say north." He looked at her. "You can take my word or not." She looked at the spot. She looked at him. "North," she said. They began that afternoon. The driving rig was cottonwood poles, because cottonwood was what was available and what her father's plans specified for the frame strong enough, flexible enough, and cuttable with what they had. Silas built the frame with Calder's help while Mara finished forging the driving point, a hardened steel cone that would separate the gravel and let the pipe follow without collapsing the formation around it. It was the most precise forging work she'd done since arriving, and she took her time with it, checking the taper twice at each stage, because the point was the whole thing if it failed or deviated underground. They'd have 60 feet of pipe going nowhere useful. Calder watched her work the driving point without speaking for about an hour, and then said, "How do you know the angle is right?" "Template," she said, and showed him the gauge she'd made from her father's specifications. "Every taper has a math to it. Too sharp and it fractures the formation. Too blunt and it can't penetrate. This angle," she turned the point in the light, "pushes the gravel sideways, not down. The pipe follows the channel it creates." He looked at the gauge. He looked at the point. "Can I check it?" She handed him the gauge. He fit it carefully and read the angle with the serious concentration of someone who understands that doing it wrong has consequences. "It's right," he said, with the slight surprise of a boy who expected to find a problem and didn't. "I know," she said, "but good to verify." He handed the gauge back. He was quiet for a moment. "Mara." "Yes, in town," he said carefully. "Some of the boys at school said they said. Their fathers said that what you're doing won't work. The well, they said their fathers said it was foolish." She kept working. "What do you think?" He was quiet. "I think you don't do things without a reason," he said. "I think you had a reason for everything else, and you probably have a reason for this." She set the driving point down and looked at him directly. "Their fathers might be right," she said. "I have my father's plans and Lusk's knowledge and the math on my side, and I could still be wrong about the depth or the formation or 12 other things. That happens." She picked the point back up. "The difference is that being wrong trying is better than being right standing still." He considered this with the solemnity that 11-year-olds bring to statements they intend to remember. "Okay," he said. The driving began the next morning. Word had moved through the county the way word always moved faster than anyone planned, attached to details that were sometimes accurate. By the time Mara and Lusk and Silas began the first driving sequence, there were 7 people standing at the edge of the site. By midday, there were 15. By the following morning, when the driving continued into its second day, there were enough people gathered that Maisie had quietly organized herself a small audience among the younger children of neighboring families who had apparently followed their parents out of curiosity. Mara did not address the gathering. She did not explain herself or the process, or ask for anyone's help. She simply worked, and Lusk stood where he needed to stand and called adjustments when the gauges told him to. And Silas managed the driving weight rigging with a focused steadiness that surprised several of the watching men who had been prepared to feel sorry for him. His hands. That was the thing they'd all known about, the damage, the failure, or what they'd called failure, the way communities reach consensus on a thing and then treat the consensus as fact. The brace Mara had built was visible when he moved, the leather and iron wrapping his forearm in a way that was neither elegant nor clumsy but simply purposeful, and he used it without self-consciousness, without the apologetic awareness of his own body that she'd seen in him the first week. He was just working. The driving weight required control and rhythm, and he had both. The men watching recalibrated something quietly in the particular way men do when a fact they've accepted turns out to be incomplete. Pipe went down steadily, 10 feet the first day, 12 the second. The driving was not fast work. It could not be fast work, not if the formation was going to be preserved the way it needed to be. Mara checked the angle every 6 feet using the system her father had described, a drop level on the first pipe section and a string measurement from the rig frame. Twice she called a stop because the readings showed a slight deviation, and each time she and Lusk conferred at the depth gauges and made an adjustment to the driving angle before continuing. Each time the gathered crowd watched this and made no comment, though she could feel in the quality of the silence whether they were confident or doubtful. She did not play to either. Aldous Crane brought food on the second day. His wife brought coffee in a large pot and a practical domestic authority that meant everyone drank it without being asked. 2 of the other neighboring ranchers brought their older sons and offered labor, which Mara accepted for the lifting work and the driving weight operation, both of which benefited from more bodies. Calder worked without stopping except to eat. Lusk spoke to Silas on the afternoon of the second day, a brief conversation at the edge of the site that Mara observed but didn't approach. She couldn't hear it, but she saw Silas's face during it, the particular attentiveness of someone receiving information they're processing against something old and unresolved, and she saw him nod at the end, a slow nod, and say something back that made Lusk look at the ground for a moment before he turned and went back to his gauges. She asked Silas about it that evening. He told me about the fence line, Silas said. What did you say? I said I'd look at the original survey documents when this was done, that if his claim had merit, we'd find a way to address it. He paused. He said my father was a difficult man. What did you say to that? I said I know. He looked at his hands, not the accounting look, just a tired look, the look of someone who has spent a long time navigating the consequences of another person's character. He wasn't always, but the last years after the hands started, he became difficult. I think he was scared and didn't know how to be scared without being hard about it. Mara thought about this. She thought about the inheritance of patterns, the way a parent's fear becomes a child's burden, whether the child knows it or not. You're not him, she said. I know, he said. It just takes a while to be sure of it. The third day of driving, 38 feet. The fourth, 47. The crowd had become a community event in ways that nobody had explicitly decided. Someone brought a fiddle on the fourth evening, which Mara considered excessive but did not object to, because people needed something to do with the waiting, and music was better than speculation. Maisie fell asleep against Crane's wife with the particular bonelessness of a thoroughly tired child, and the woman put her arm around her without making anything of it. And that small moment was somehow the most ordinary and the most significant thing Mara saw all week. On the 5th morning, Lusk arrived before the others. He stood at the rig and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at his gauges. Today, he said when Mara came to stand beside him. Confident, she said. 80%, he said. Which is as confident as I get about things underground. That's good enough, she said, but it was at 49 feet that the resistance changed. She felt it before she could explain it, a shift in the quality of the driving, the way the weight was meeting the pipe, something in the feedback through the rig frame that was different from the steady resistance of compacted gravel. She held up her hand, and the driving crew stopped. Lusk was at the gauges immediately. He pushed the probe down alongside the pipe casing and read it twice. He looked up at her. "You're at the formation," he said. "Edge of it." The crowd had gone completely quiet. 8 feet, Lusk said. Maybe 9, but carefully. "If you breach it wrong, you can channel the pressure sideways and lose it." She looked at the driving rig. She looked at the pipe. She looked at the men who had been working the driving weight for 5 days, the ranchers and their sons, big, capable men who had done everything she'd asked with more discipline than she'd honestly expected. She walked to where Silas was standing. "I need you on the driving weight," she said, quietly enough that it wasn't a public announcement. He looked at her. "Me, not for force," she said. "Control. What we need now isn't strength, it's steadiness. Consistent impact, same force every time, no variation." She met his eyes. "You've been doing that with the forge work for 3 weeks. You do it with the brace better than anyone I've shown because you can't compensate with grip, so you've learned to compensate with rhythm." She paused. "It needs to be you." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gathered crowd was watching without pretending not to. "If I miss the angle," he started. "Lusk will tell us if you miss the angle," she said. "That's his job. Your job is to hit the same spot the same way 8 times. He looked at the brace on his arm. He looked at the driving mechanism. "All right," he said. She set the rig for the final approach. She went through the measurements one more time, not because she doubted them, but because this was the kind of work where doubt is more useful than confidence. And she'd learned that from her father's margin notes on the 14 attempts that had gone wrong before the one that hadn't. Lusk took his position at the gauges. Silas took the driving weight. The crowd pulled back without being asked. The instinct of people who understand that something is happening that requires room. The first blow steady. True, the second, same force. Same angle. Lusk read the gauge, nodded. 3rd, 4th. 5th. At the 6th blow, something changed in the sound. A hollow resonance underneath the impact, subtle but distinct, like the pipe had found a different medium below it. Lusk held up his hand. "Stop, silence." He pushed the probe down alongside the pipe. He read it. He pushed it again. His face was doing something complicated. "You're through the formation cap," he said. "You're in the pressurized zone." Crowd made no sound. 2 more, Lusk said. "No more than that." And steady, Silas hit it twice more. Then they waited. For what felt like a very long time, Mara would later calculate it at approximately 90 seconds. But it felt longer than that, the kind of longer that comes from many people holding their breath in the same place. Nothing happened. Someone coughed. A child shifted. And then from the top of the pipe, something moved. It was slow at first. A dark, gritty flow that was almost mud. The accumulated sediment of the formation above the aquifer normal. Expected. Documented in her father's notes as the first thing to come before the clear water. She watched it without speaking. Beside her, Lusk watched it without speaking. Then the color began to change. Gray to dark gray to something lighter. And then lighter still. And then Vernon Pike's voice cut through the crowd from the edge of the site. She hadn't seen him arrive. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was on horseback, which gave him the height advantage he'd clearly calculated, and he had 2 men with him who had the deliberate neutrality of men being paid to stand where they're told. "Mr. Rourke," Pike said. Not loud. He didn't need to be loud. The quiet he walked into did that work for him. "That well is on a formation whose surface rights belong to my company's survey zone. I'll need you to stop the operation until a legal review." "Your survey zone doesn't include my land," Silas said. His voice was flat. "The underground formation is under my land," Silas said. "Which makes it mine." Pike smiled. It was not an unpleasant smile, which made it worse somehow. These things are rarely that simple. The law on subsurface water rights in Dakota Territory is— "The law," said Lusk. From where he was standing, not turning around, still watching the pipe, says that an owner has rights to the water directly below his land. I was on the county water board for 11 years before you bought your way onto it, Vernon. Don't quote water law at me." Pike looked at Lusk. Something moved in his face recognition, recalculation. "Old man," he said carefully, "you should think about whose side is worth being on here." "I've been thinking about it," Lusk said. That's how I ended up over here. And then the water ran clear. It came up slowly at first, and then with a steadiness that built in volume over the span of about 30 seconds. And then it was simply flowing crystal water, clean and cold from 60 feet below the frozen prairie, rising without a pump, without effort on its own pressure, the way her father's plans had promised it would when everything was done right. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Maisie, from where she'd been standing, with her repaired doll pressed against her chest, said in a small and completely earnest voice, "It works." Several adults laughed, the involuntary kind that comes from relief cracking through. Pike sat on his horse and watched the water run. His expression was unreadable. He was a careful man, and careful men don't react publicly when their plans encounter significant resistance. They recalculate, they look for the next angle. He turned his horse and rode away with his 2 men, and he didn't say anything else. Mara watched him go. She stood with water running cold over her boots, and she watched Vernon Pike ride off the property he'd spent a year trying to ruin, and she thought, he's not done. He's not the kind of man who's done after one setback. But she also thought, neither am I, behind her. The crowd had broken into something that was not quite celebration and not quite disbelief, but a mixture of both, the sound of people who came expecting to watch something fail and stayed long enough to see it not fail, and are now uncertain how to hold that. Aldous Crane was shaking Silas's hand. His wife was crying in the practical, brief way of someone who considers public crying acceptable in exceptional circumstances. Calder stood at the pipe and watched the water run, with an expression that Mara recognized as the face he made when he was committing something to memory. Lusk was packing his gauges. She went to him. "Thank you," she said. "I came for the geology. I know," she said. Still, he snapped his gauge case shut. "Talk to your husband about the survey documents," he said. "I meant what I said." "I know you did," she said. So did he. Lusk looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that was hard to read, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a kind of honesty they weren't prepared to encounter. "Your father taught you well," he said. "He tried," she said. "It wasn't always easy to teach." Another almost smile. "Smart people rarely are." He picked up his case. "You've got a good formation there. Pressure will hold through winter. Come spring, it'll feed 200 head easy." She watched him walk to his wagon. She watched him drive off without ceremony. Then she turned back to the site. The water was still running. Silas was standing beside the pipe, not talking to anyone, just standing there with the brace on his arm and the water moving over the frozen ground around his boots. She walked over to him, and they stood together for a moment, not saying anything, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said yet. After a while, Calder appeared beside them. He looked at the water. He looked at the pipe. He said, "We should build a proper housing for this before the temperature will drop tonight. If the exposed pipe freezes at the top, we'll lose the flow." Silas looked at him. Mara looked at him. "You're right," Mara said. "What do you need?" "Boards," he said, already looking at the outbuilding with the systematic focus of someone who has already identified where the lumber is, and some of the forge insulation batting, and someone to help carry. He walked toward the outbuilding with his hands in his pockets, and his jaw set in the expression that had stopped meaning anger weeks ago, and now simply meant he was working on something. Silas watched him go. He didn't ask, he said. He knew what needed doing, she said. He looked at her. That open expression again, the one she'd stopped being surprised to see. "Yeah," he said. He did. She started to move toward the outbuilding to help Calder, but Silas caught her arm, just lightly. "Mara," she stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was a man who used words carefully, not because he was cold, but because he'd learned early that careless words did lasting damage, and he'd rather say less and mean it. "What you did," he said. "The pipe, Petrie. The 4 days," he stopped. "Calder asked me last night what kind of person does that. Goes and works 4 days at a railroad yard for pipe, and comes back." "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him I was still figuring it out," Silas said. She held his gaze for a moment. And I think he said carefully that it's the kind of person who doesn't do things by half. He paused. "I'm not good at I don't say things the way." He stopped again. Silas, she said, the water is running. He blinked. That's enough for today, she said. Say the rest when you have the words for it. He let out a breath, nodded. She went to help Calder with the boards. The housing went up before dark, rough cut, and serviceable, with forge batting packed around the exposed pipe in a way that would hold through temperatures well below zero. Calder directed most of it. He had good instincts for the structural parts, and he accepted Mara's guidance on the thermal insulation without the resistance he'd have shown 6 weeks ago. The easy collaboration of someone who has decided to trust a person's knowledge without requiring it to be proven every time. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it. It's not pretty, he said. It's not supposed to be pretty, she said. It's supposed to work. Considered this as a design philosophy. Yeah, he said. Okay. They walked back to the house in the near dark, and Maisie met them at the door with a question about supper, and Silas was inside already. And the kitchen smelled like the coffee he'd put on. And for a moment, all of it, the pipe and the water and Pike riding away, and Lusk's maps and the 4 days at the railroad yard, and her father's handwriting in the margin notes, all of it settled into the specific. Ordinary weight of a day that had changed something real. Not solved everything, not closed every door that needed closing. Pike had ridden away without speaking, and that was not the behavior of a man accepting defeat. She knew that. She'd known it standing at the pipe, watching him go. But the water was running, and the water for tonight was enough. Pike moved faster than she'd expected. That was the thing about careful men, you could mistake their patience for slowness, and then one morning you woke up to find they'd been moving the whole time, just in directions you weren't watching. 3 days after the well came in, Mara was at the forge before sunrise when Aldous Crane arrived, and his face had the tight, controlled look of a man who has been up most of the night with bad news he doesn't want to deliver. She didn't stop working. Tell me, she said. Pike filed an injunction, Crane said. Yesterday afternoon. County court. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. His lawyer wrote out to 4 properties last night. Mine included. Says the underground formation is a shared resource, and any individual exploitation of it requires county board approval. He set the paper on the workbench. The board meets in 3 weeks. Mara set down her tongs. She picked up the paper. She read it twice, which was how she read anything legal, once for what it said, once for what it was trying to do. Pike's lawyer had written it with the specific efficiency of someone who knew exactly which words would produce uncertainty in men who couldn't afford lawyers of their own. The language around shared subsurface resources was technically plausible without being legally settled, which was precisely the point. You didn't need to win an injunction to use one. You just needed it to take long enough that Winter did the work for you. He's not trying to win in court, she said. Crane looked at her. What do you mean? He's trying to slow us down. She folded the paper. 3 weeks. If we can't drill more wells in 3 weeks, if the other ranchers spend 3 weeks waiting to see how the legal question resolves, the cattle start suffering in January, and the family starts selling in February. She looked at Crane. How many of your neighbors are scared enough to wait? Crane was quiet. That was its own answer. She thought about it for a moment. Then, who on the county water board isn't Pike's man? Harlan Best, Crane said without hesitation. He's been on the board 12 years. Old school. Doesn't like Pike, but he's careful about it. Can you get me a meeting with Best today? Maybe. He's at his farm on Tuesdays. Today is Tuesday, she said. Crane looked at her for a long moment. He was a good man, the kind of good that is made of small, consistent choices rather than any single dramatic act, and he'd been watching what happened at the well with the particular attention of someone who is recalibrating what is possible. I'll ride out this morning, he said. She went back to the forge and picked up her tongs. After Crane left, she worked for another hour. But the work was mechanical, her hands doing what they knew, while her mind ran the problem from multiple directions. The way her father had taught her to think about a design that wasn't working. Turning it over, looking at it from the angle it least wanted to be looked at. Pike had 3 moves available to him. The injunction was the first. The second was social, using the community's uncertainty to make collaboration feel dangerous, the same way he'd used gossip against the ranch before the wedding. The third was financial, which meant finding which families were close enough to the edge that a direct offer would be more attractive than a legal fight. She needed to close all three before he could use them. That was a large thing to need before the end of December. She told Silas over breakfast. He listened, and she watched his face move through the sequence, the recognition, the assessment, the particular set of his jaw that wasn't anger, but was the thing that lived next to anger in a practical man. "He won't stop," Silas said, not surprised, just confirming something he'd known since the water came up. "No," she said. "What do you need?" She looked at him across the table. In the weeks since she'd arrived, his face had changed in ways that were small and probably invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching closely. The exhausted flatness of a man surviving had started to give way to something with more texture, not happiness exactly, because the situation didn't allow for uncomplicated happiness, but engagement. He was thinking again instead of just enduring. "I need you to talk to the other ranchers," she said. "Not about the injunction, about the well, about what the aquifer means if every family can access it themselves. They'll be nervous about the legal question." "I know," she said. "Tell them that the legal question is Pike's strategy, not a genuine legal problem. Lusk can speak to the water rights. He knows the statutes better than Pike's lawyer." She paused. "And I need them to not wait 3 weeks. I need them to start ordering pipe." Silas looked at her steadily. "If the injunction holds." "It won't hold," she said. "How do you know?" "Because it's not grounded in anything that'll survive a real challenge," she said. "Doesn't matter if I'm right about that. What matters is that the families believe the question is already settled before the court date, and the only way to do that is for them to already be moving." She put her coffee down. "If 12 families are ordering pipe and 4 are already drilling when the board meets, Pike's injunction starts to look like a man trying to close a barn after the horses are out." Silas thought about this. "That's a gamble." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll ride out this afternoon." She nodded. She stood up, then Silas. He looked up. "The Henderson parcel," she said. "The creek access he fenced. We should talk about that too." His expression shifted. "I've been thinking about it. And I'm not going to cut his fence," he said. "I told you that before." "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm suggesting." She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "I'm suggesting we find out exactly what his legal basis is for fencing a public adjacent waterway. Because if the creek access has any prior use history, if any of the neighboring ranchers used that crossing before Henderson owned it, there may be an established right-of-way that the fence violates." Silas stared at her. "How long have you been thinking about that?" he said. "Since he bought it," she said, and went to the forge. Harlan Bess was 63 and had the look of a man who had spent 6 decades outdoors and was frankly annoyed by the passage of time. He met Mara at his kitchen table with the wary courtesy of someone who does not entirely trust unexpected visitors, but was raised to behave as if he does. She didn't bring the injunction paperwork. She left it with Crane deliberately because arriving with Pike's documents would frame the conversation as a legal dispute, and she didn't want a legal frame. She wanted a practical one. She told Bess about the aquifer. She told him about Lusk's maps, about the pressurized formation, about the scope of what was underneath the county, how many properties sat above it, what it would mean for each of them if they could access it independently rather than depending on surface water that a single party could manipulate. Bess listened. He was a good listener, the kind who doesn't show you what he's thinking while you're talking, which made him either trustworthy or dangerous in experience, suggested the former. "I know about the aquifer," he said when she finished. "Lusk told me about it years ago. I've been waiting to see what Pike would do with it since he bought that ridge." Mara looked at him. "You knew Pike bought the ridge to control the recharge zone." "I suspected it," he said with the precision of a careful man. "Suspecting and knowing are different things. I have the blasted gravel from the spring basin," she said. "I have Lusk's maps showing the formation. I have the timeline of Pike's drainage cuts against the timeline spring failures in the county. If that's not enough to bring before the board, Bess said carefully, has 3 members. I'm one. Pike's man Doyle is one. The third is Clement Marsh, who is not Pike's man but who is frightened of him. He folded his hands on the table. If Marsh votes with me, the injunction fails, and we can formalize a protocol for individual well drilling. If Marsh votes with Doyle, the injunction holds until a territorial court overrules it, which takes months. What does Marsh need to vote with you? Mara said. Bess was quiet for a long moment. Clement Marsh has a daughter whose husband is 1 year behind on his mortgage, he said. The mortgage is held by Pike's bank affiliate in Bismarck. He looked at her steadily. Marsh votes against Pike, that mortgage gets called. The room was very quiet. That's not legal, she said. No, Bess agreed. It's also not something I can prove in time to matter. He unfolded his hands. Pike doesn't get where he is by doing illegal things in obvious ways. He does legal things in arrangements that happen to produce the same outcome. Mara sat with this for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up. It would snow before nightfall. She thought the sky had that particular hard brightness. What does the mortgage amount to? She said. $340, Bess said. Roughly, she thought. If the mortgage were held by someone other than Pike's affiliate. Bess looked at her sharply. If Marsh's son-in-law refinanced the note through a different lender, she said, before the board meeting, if Pike no longer held that leverage. Where would that financing come from? Bess said. It was not a rhetorical question. He was actually asking. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I have 3 weeks. He studied her for a long moment. He was, she thought, a man deciding how much to trust someone, and doing it with the care of someone who had learned that fast trust was its own kind of carelessness. The injunction, he said finally, the language about subsurface resources. It has a specific weakness. He got up and went to the shelf beside the kitchen window, where a stack of folded documents sat with the orderly neglect of things that are important but not immediately urgent. He pulled one out and brought it back to the table. 17 years ago, the territorial legislature passed an act covering agricultural water rights. Section 12, paragraph 4. It was written to address irrigation disputes, but the language is broad. He unfolded the document and put it in front of her. Read the underlined part. She read it. It was not legally complex language. It said, in plain terms, that water accessed from beneath a property through means that did not divert surface flow from neighboring properties was the exclusive right of the property owner. No board approval required. Pike's lawyer either missed this or is hoping everyone else does, she said. Pike's lawyer has been practicing in Dakota Territory for 4 years, Bess said. I've been reading its statutes for 20. He folded the document and held it out to her. Take this. Have someone who can read legal language read the whole section. He paused. And find that refinancing. She rode back in the wind with the document inside her coat and the specific focused energy of someone who has found the shape of a solution but not yet the material to build it from. $340. She ran numbers in her head against what the forge had made in the past 6 weeks, against what Petrie's card might be worth in future contract work, against what she had in the bottom of the tool chest that was not tools. She'd been avoiding that calculation. She did it now. There were her father's hand tools, the good ones, the ones he'd used his whole career. There was the folio of drawings. There was the small locked box at the very bottom that held $45 in savings, everything she'd managed to pull from the wreckage of the Fargo shop before she'd had to leave it. And there was the set of specialty forming dies her father had made by hand over 20 years, unique pieces that no manufacturer produced, that would sell to the right buyer a large railroad operation, a mining company, for somewhere between $200 and $300. She would not sell the folio. She would not sell the hand tools, but the dies. The dies were tools she hadn't used once since arriving and might not use, and were valuable specifically because of their rarity. She thought about this for the rest of the ride home. She found Silas in the barn when she got back, tending to a cow that had come up lame on the back left. He was crouched beside it, his brace-wrapped arm managing the examination with a careful thoroughness, and he didn't look up when she came in. "How's the leg?" she said. "Bruised, not broken," he said. She stepped in a frozen rut this morning. He straightened, slowly, the way people do when a position has been held past its comfort. "How's Bess?" she told him. "All of it the board structure, Marsh. The mortgage, the territorial statute. She watched his face as she talked, and she could see him tracking it, following the logic, registering the implications. $340, he said. Yes. He was quiet. He had the look of a man who was about to say something he'd already decided to say, and was simply building the sentence carefully. I have 60 in savings, he said. Not much, but I have 45, she said, and I'm thinking about the forming dies. He looked at her. He knew what the dies were. She'd shown him the chest. All of it. In the first week, because they were living in the same house, and she believed in being clear about what she had and what it meant to her. He knew those dies were her father's work. He knew what she'd be giving up. No, he said. Silas, he said again, not harshly. There's another way. What way? He rubbed the back of his neck. My father had a note out to Lars Johansson, a neighboring rancher, 3 miles east. Johansson paid it off 2 years before my father died, but my father never— there's a record of it in the ranch accounts. The note was for $215. Johansson's an honest man. If I go to him and explain, he stopped. It's not a debt. It's not something I have a right to collect. But it was money that was paid to my father and recorded, and it might be a basis for an informal loan, she said, following where he was going. He's got a good operation, Silas said. If I explain what's at stake, the aquifer, what it means for his property too, he might extend credit against the goodwill. She looked at him. This was your father's money, she said. Paid back. It doesn't— I know what it is and isn't, he said. I'm not claiming a debt. I'm asking a neighbor for help based on a history of honesty between our families. He looked at the lame cow for a moment. Which is different. She thought about the distinction. It was a real distinction. Go tomorrow, she said. I need to write to someone in Bismarck first, about the refinancing mechanism. If Johansson will lend against goodwill, I need to know if a private note can replace a bank mortgage, or if we need a different structure. Silas looked at her. Do you know someone in Bismarck? Petrie gave me a card, she said. The Northern Line foreman. He works out of Bismarck. He'll know a lawyer or a bank officer who isn't tied to Pike's network. She paused. It's a reach. Most of what we've done has been a reach, Silas said. Yes, she said. And it's kept working so far, he said. Not pessimistic. Just honest so far, she agreed. She wrote the letter that night after the children were asleep, 3 pages to Petrie's contact, laying out the situation in plain terms without drama or embellishment, because she'd found that requests for help worked better when they were specific and honest rather than emotional. She explained the mortgage amount, the timeline, the legal mechanism, what she needed in terms of a structured private note, and who would need to sign it. She ended by saying that the party whose mortgage needed refinancing was not wealthy and not a risk of default, that the only reason his note was a vulnerability was because of who held it, not whether he was paying it. She sealed it and addressed it and put it with Crane's mail to go out the next morning. Then she sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at her father's folio, which she'd brought down for no particular reason, except that sometimes she needed to see his handwriting when the problem she was working on was too large, and she needed to remember that large problems had been solved before, by a man with less information and worse tools, and the same basic stubbornness about not giving up on things that mattered. She opened it to the well plans. She read the margin notes in the section about pressure formation access. Her father had written, in the cramped, dense handwriting he used when he was working something out, the error most people make is assuming the water has to go where you want it. The water goes where physics lets it go. Your job is to understand the physics and put the pipe where the water already wants to be. Close the folio. She went to bed. The next 10 days were not clean or simple or anything like a story where things progress in a logical line. They were the actual texture of a difficult situation being navigated by imperfect people with limited resources in bad weather. Silas rode to Johansson's farm. He came back without a yes or no. Johansson needed 2 days to think, which was reasonable but hard to wait through. Crane's wife organized what she called a practical discussion among the neighboring women, which was her term for a meeting where wives compared notes on what their husbands were planning to do about the injunction, and quietly applied the specific influence that keeps men from making decisions based purely on fear. Mara did not attend this meeting. She was at the forge, but she heard afterward that it had been productive. Calder asked her 3 days after the injunction news if they were going to lose the ranch. She was working the bellows when he asked, and she didn't stop. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard Dad talking to Crane," he said. "About money, about the board meeting. We're not going to lose the ranch," she said. "How do you know?" She looked at him. He was 11 years old, and he was asking a real question that deserved a real answer, not a reassurance. "I don't know for certain," she said. "What I know is that we have a water source Pike can't take back, a legal statute Bess found that undercuts the injunction, and 4 people working on the money problem from different directions. She kept working the bellows. Things can still go wrong, but the shape of the problem is different than it was 2 months ago." He thought about this with the systematic seriousness he brought to everything. "2 months ago we had nothing," he said. "You had a forge that didn't work and a spring that was dying," she said. "So yes, the comparison is favorable." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what can I do?" She looked at him. He was asking genuinely, not to be reassured that there was nothing, but because he was an 11-year-old who had decided that usefulness was the best thing he had to offer, and he intended to offer it. "The Mercer family," she said. 3 farms north. Crane says they're closest to ordering pipe for a well of their own, but the husband is hesitant because he's not sure about the drilling process. He's never seen it done. She looked at Calder steadily. "You have. You were there for all 5 days of it. You know what it looks like and how it works." She paused. "If you went and talked to the Mercer boy, you know him from school, and explained what you watched, that might help." Calder looked at her. Something moved in his face, the specific awareness of someone who has just been handed a real responsibility rather than a softened version of one. "I know Henry Mercer," he said. "His dad won't listen to me." "I'm 11. He might listen to you explain what you watched," she said. Men who are uncertain about a technical process often receive information better from someone who witnessed it than from someone who's trying to sell them on it. "You're not selling. You're describing." He thought about this for a moment. Then he untied his apron. He'd been learning to bank the forge and hung it up. "I'll go this afternoon," he said. He went. Mara didn't ask him about it when he came back because he was an 11-year-old who needed to manage the result of his own initiative without being debriefed immediately. But 2 days later, Crane told her that Mercer had placed an order for pipe. The letter from Bismarck arrived 6 days after she sent hers. Petrie's contact was a man named Adler, a bank officer with the Northern Commerce Bank, which had no connection to Pike's financial network. His letter was brief and direct. The refinancing was legally straightforward. A private lender note could replace a bank mortgage with full legal standing, and if the amount was under $500 and the borrower was current on payments, the process could be completed within a week of receiving the necessary documents. He enclosed the relevant forms. He also wrote, at the bottom, "Petrie told me about the flange coupling. Sounds like you do good work. If you want to talk about that contract opportunity in the spring, I know the right people." She read that twice. Then she set it aside and focused on the forms. The financing came together on the 9th day. Johansson came back with a yes, not the full amount, but $180, which combined with Silas's $60 and her $45 and $35 more that Crane contributed without being asked, left them $12 short. She found the 12 in a combination of the week's forge payments, specifically because a farmer named Roth had brought 3 jobs at once and paid in advance. She did not find this poetic. She found it a relief. The documents went to Adler in Bismarck by the fastest mail available. His office contacted Marsh's son-in-law directly. The man, his name was Dreyer, and he had apparently been losing sleep over the Pike-held mortgage for the better part of a year, signed the refinancing papers within 2 days. Pike found out 4 days before the board meeting. She knew he'd found out because Crane's wife told her that Pike had been seen at the county clerk's office asking questions about the Dreyer property transaction, and that he had left with the expression of a man who has discovered that one of the pieces he was depending on has been moved. The board meeting was held at the county hall, a building that was nominally civic, but in practice doubled as a general meeting space for anything requiring more room than a kitchen. It was standing space only by the time the session started, which told Mara something about how far word had traveled and how many families understood what was being decided. Pike was there. He arrived exactly on time, not early, not late, with his lawyer beside him and the composed expression of a man who believes the outcome is still manageable. He did not look at Mara when he came in. He looked at Bess and then at Marsh, and something in his face changed very slightly, a tightening around the eyes that was the closest thing to public emotion she'd seen from him. He'd seen Marsh's face. Clement Marsh was 61 and had the look of a man who had spent a year carrying a weight that was finally this morning not on him anymore. He sat at the board table with his hands flat in front of him, and he did not look at Pike. Bess opened the session. He was methodical and unhurried. He presented the Territorial Statute, Section 12, Paragraph 4, and read the relevant language aloud in the dry, exact tone of a man who has been waiting for the right moment to use something for a very long time. He presented Lusk's geological maps, submitted as evidence of the formation's scope. He presented the timeline of spring failures against the timeline of Pike's drainage construction, a sequence of dates that told a story without anyone needing to editorialize. Pike's lawyer objected twice. Both times Bess said noted and continued. When Bess finished, Pike's lawyer made his argument. He was competent and well prepared, and he built the case for the shared resource interpretation with the skill of someone who had done this before in similar venues. It took 20 minutes. When he finished, there was a silence in the room. Bess said, "The board will vote." He voted against the injunction. Marsh voted against the injunction. Doyle voted for it. The injunction failed 2-1. The room made a sound. Pike stood up. He had the controlled expression of a man keeping something internal very firmly internal. He looked at Bess. He looked at Marsh. He looked finally at Mara. "You're very clever," he said. It was not a compliment, and it wasn't meant as one. It was the statement of a man categorizing someone, deciding what category of problem they represent. "I'm practical," she said. "There's more than one board," he said. "More than one court. There's also more than one aquifer," she said. "And more than one rancher who can drill a well." Something in his face shifted. Not the composure that held, but something behind it. The calculation. She could see him running it, and arriving at the same place she'd arrived weeks ago, that the scheme's whole structure depended on control of a resource that was now being accessed independently by increasing numbers of people across the county. Each new well reduced his leverage. Each rancher who drilled independently reduced the value of what he was trying to sell access to. The math had turned. He knew it. He left without his lawyer saying anything further. Bess came to stand beside her after the room began to move and talk and rearrange itself into the specific social formation of people processing a shared event. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at where Pike had been standing. "He'll try something else," Bess said. "Yes," she said. "The spring damage, the diversion. If someone were to pursue that formally, that requires a lawyer," she said. "A good one. And time." "You've managed both before," he said. She looked at him. He was a careful man, Harlan Bess, and careful men didn't say things like that without meaning them to land. "I'll think about it," she said, but there was something she needed to do first. She found Silas in the crowd and told him it was done. He didn't say anything for a moment. He put his hand on her arm, just briefly, the way people do when words aren't the right instrument. Then Crane appeared with a question about the drilling schedule, and the moment passed into the next practical thing. On the way home, with the sky going dark and the temperature dropping, and the wagon moving through the familiar ruts of the road back to Red Willow Ranch, Calder said from the back where he'd been riding, "Pike looked at you like he was deciding something." "He was," she said. "What?" "Whether to keep fighting," she said. "What do you think he decided?" She thought about the math. About the wells being ordered, about the aquifer under 60% of the county, spreading wide and deep, belonging to whoever put pipe through it, about the shape of Pike's scheme and how many of its pieces were already gone. "I think," she said carefully, that he's going to decide that the cost of continuing is more than the return. And if he doesn't, Calder said. She was quiet for a moment. Then we'll deal with that, she said. He accepted this without argument, which was its own kind of progress. Maisie was asleep by the time they got home, which meant the evening was quiet in the way evenings get when the tension of a long day finally runs out and the house settles. Silas built up the stove while Mara checked the well housing still holding, the insulation batting doing its job against the temperature. The water was still running, a steady flow in the dark, clean and cold. She stood at the pipe for a minute, just stood there. She wasn't sentimental, as a rule. She didn't have her father's habit of marking moments. He'd had a jar where he put a stone for each significant day, a practice she'd always considered excessive. But she understood it better now than she had when she was young and impatient with everything symbolic. She went inside. Silas was at the table with 2 mugs of coffee. She sat across from him and took one. Bess thinks we should pursue the spring damage formally, she said. What do you think? I think he's right, she said. I think it's a fight we could win and a message we need to send. She turned the mug in her hands. I also think it'll take money we don't have yet. The Northern Line contract, he said. Maybe, she said. And the forge is making more each week. If Calder keeps... She stopped. He's good, Silas said, quietly. Just that he is, she said. He's going to be very good. Silas looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands around the mug, the brace sitting on the table beside him, where he'd taken it off, the leather and iron that had made the difference at the driving rig. He looked like a man arriving at something he'd been approaching for a while. When you came here, he said, I told myself it was an arrangement. Practical, something that made sense for the ranch. She waited. I was wrong about that, he said. Or not wrong, exactly. I was incomplete. He looked up at her. I don't know how to say this without it sounding less than what it is. Try anyway, she said. You can correct it afterward. Corner of his mouth moved. He was quiet for a moment. I'm grateful, he said. That's the small version. The larger version is that you came here and you saw what this place could be instead of what it looked like, and you built things and fixed things and you didn't... He stopped, started again. You didn't do it to rescue us. You did it because it needed doing, and you could do it. And that's different. That's a different thing to be on the receiving end of. She held his gaze across the table. You pitched that east section, she said. 3 years of not being able to do it, and you did it. Because of the brace. Because of what you did with the brace, she said. The brace is just iron and leather. You decided what to do with it. He looked at her for a long moment. You are the most difficult person to give credit to, he said. I know, she said. Calder says the same thing. This time the almost smile became the real thing, brief and unguarded, and she'd seen it before, but it still had the quality of something you didn't expect and were glad to find. Picked up his coffee. Mara, he said. Yes. He looked at her with the open expression, not careful now, not assessed and measured. Just direct. I said I didn't know if I was capable of that part. When we talked about the marriage, she waited. I was wrong about that too, he said. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind moved over the frozen prairie without finding any particular resistance on Red Willow Ranch. She picked up her coffee. I know, she said. They sat there in the quiet kitchen for a while longer, not saying anything else, and the not saying was the right kind, not empty, not avoiding, but full of the specific weight of 2 people who have done something hard together and are, for this moment, simply sitting in what that has built. Eventually she got up and went to bed, and somewhere in the dark outside, the well ran on. The week after the board meeting, Pike made his 3rd move. It was not the move she'd expected, which was either a sign that she'd underestimated him or that he was more desperate than his composure suggested. She'd been prepared for another legal filing, another board maneuver, another careful arrangement designed to produce consequences without fingerprints. What he sent instead was a man named Colbert, who arrived at the forge on a Wednesday morning with a card from Pike's office and the practiced pleasantness of someone whose job is to make unpleasant things sound reasonable. Mara was working when he came in. She didn't stop. Colbert looked at the forge, the tools, the organized competence of the workspace, and seemed to recalibrate whatever he'd been expecting. He was maybe 40, well-dressed for the county, with the particular smoothness of a man who spent his professional life in negotiation. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "I represent Mr. Pike's business interests. He's asked me to convey an offer." "I'm listening," she said, still working. He laid it out. It was, she had to acknowledge, a better offer than she'd expected, better than the gossip and the injunction and the fence, all of which had been moves against her. This was a move toward her, which was more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous. Pike was offering a professional shop in Crooked Creek, fully equipped, rent-free for 3 years. A contract for all county blacksmithing work affiliated with his development projects. A cash payment, he said the figure, and it was substantial, more than she'd made in 2 years in Fargo for the driven well design and the drilling specifications. And attached quietly at the end, like something almost forgotten, the Henderson parcel, deeded to Red Willow Ranch. She set down her iron. She looked at Colbert directly for the first time since he'd come in. "He's offering me the creek access back," she said. "As part of a comprehensive settlement." "Yes," Colbert said. "Mr. Pike feels the situation has become," he chose the word carefully, "counterproductive for all parties." "He feels it's becoming expensive," she said. Colbert's expression didn't change. "He's offering you everything you came here without," he said. "Financial security, a proper establishment, protection for this ranch. He's not a vindictive man, Mrs. Rourke. He recognizes talent. He'd rather have it working alongside his interests than against them." She picked up her iron again. She thought about it seriously, but she owed the offer because it was serious. A shop of her own, real equipment, not rebuilt and salvaged. The creek access that Silas needed. Money enough to stop counting every payment from the forge against the next month's coal cost. She thought about what that would feel like to not be calculating, for once, whether what she had was enough for what was coming. She thought about 12 families with their pipes on order. She thought about Lusk's maps and what they showed about how many properties sat above that formation, how many people didn't know yet that the water was there, waiting 60 feet below their frozen ground. She thought about what happened to those little... If the only person who understood how to access it sold the knowledge to the man who was trying to use it as leverage over them. She thought about her father, who had written in his margin notes, "The error most people make is assuming the water has to go where you want it." Pike was offering to buy the water's direction. "Tell Mr. Pike," she said, "that the offer is generous." Colbert straightened slightly, reading something in her tone. "Tell him I'm not interested," she said. "Not in the shop, not in the contract, not in the cash. Tell him the well design is not for sale because it was never mine to sell, it was my father's. And he built it for people who needed water, not for people who wanted to control who had it." She looked at Colbert steadily. "The creek parcel, if he wants to return it to settle the legal dispute about the spring damage, we can discuss that through proper channels. With Bess present." Colbert looked at her for a moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that refusing this offer means Mr. Pike has less reason to moderate his approach going forward." "I understand that's what you've been asked to imply," she said. "You can tell him I've thought about it and I'm still not interested." He left. She stood at the forge for a few minutes after, not working, just standing. She was not, in that moment, entirely certain she'd done the right thing. That was the honest version of what was in her, not doubt exactly, but the acknowledgement that the offer had been real, and real things are worth being honest about having wanted, even when you don't take them. She'd wanted the shop. She'd wanted the security. She was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. But you can want something and know it would cost too much and set it down anyway. That's not nobility, it's just arithmetic. She picked up her iron and went back to work. She told Silas that evening. She told him the whole offer, including the creek parcel, and she watched his face move through what that represented, how much they'd needed that access, how many difficult weeks it had been worth, what it meant that Pike had offered it as a sweetener. "He's scared," Silas said. "He's calculating," she said. "Which is what scared looks like on a man like that." "What happens now? Now we do what we were going to do anyway," she said. "We pursue the spring damage through Bess. We help the other ranchers drill. We build the forge into something that doesn't need anyone's backing to survive." He was quiet for a moment. "And the parcel? If he wants to settle the spring damage, the parcel comes back as part of it," she said. "Not as a bribe to stop us from doing anything, as a consequence of what he caused." Silas looked at his hands. He looked at the brace on the table. "You know," he said, "when I was standing at that train platform, waiting for Clara Beecham, I had a very specific idea of what I needed. Someone capable, someone who could manage." He paused. "I was right about what I needed. I was completely wrong about what it would look like." She met his eyes. "You weren't wrong," she said. "You just didn't have enough information." "Neither did you," he said, "when you got on that wagon with me." "No," she agreed, "I didn't." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. The brace-wrapped forearm, the damaged grip that had learned to be accurate, instead of strong, it rested on her hand, with the steady weight of something that had stopped apologizing for what it was. She didn't move her hand. "I meant what I said," he said. "Last week. I was wrong about that part being finished." "I know," she said. "I meant what I said, too." She looked at him. "I'm not easy to be with. I work before I talk, and I solve before I feel, and I've been told more than once that I'm better with iron than with people." "You fixed Maisie's doll the first night," he said. "You sat up until the glue set so you wouldn't disturb her sleeping." "She was quiet. You went to Lusk on your own," he said. "You rode 8 miles in November cold to talk to a man who'd had a dispute with my father, and you got him to come." He paused. "You don't get to tell me you're not good with people. You're very precise with people. That's different from not being good with them." She looked at the table for a moment. "My father said the same thing," she said. "He said I had a gift for finding exactly what a person needed, and I was terrible at letting them know I saw it." She paused. "He wasn't wrong. He sounds like he was a good man," Silas said. "He was," she said. "He was also stubborn and occasionally infuriating, and he kept every piece of metal he ever worked with, because he said you never knew when a scrap would solve the next problem." She looked at the folio, which was sitting on the shelf where she kept it now, within reach. He was right about that, too. Silas looked at the folio. He'd learned what it represented, not just the well plans, but the 30 years of a man's thinking, the careful record of a craftsman who believed that knowledge was more valuable when shared than when kept. "We should make copies," he said, "of the well plans. The full specifications." She looked at him. "For the other families," he said. "If they have the plans themselves, not just the drilling rig, but the actual engineering, they don't need to depend on you being available. They can troubleshoot their own wells, train their own people." She thought about this. It was a better idea than she'd had. She'd been thinking about the drilling rig as a shared resource, something families could borrow. But the plans were more fundamental. The plans made the rig reproducible. Plans made the knowledge independent of any single person. "We'd need someone who writes clearly," she said. "My hand is workable, but not." "Bess," Silas said. "He has a clerk who produces court documents." "Clean, precise, reproducible." He paused. "I think he'd say yes." She nodded slowly. "I'll talk to him this week." The conversation with Bess happened on Friday, and he said yes before she finished explaining, which was the response of a man who had already been thinking along the same lines and was waiting for someone to say it first. His clerk, a young man named Garfield, who had the focused intensity of someone who took extreme pride in legible penmanship, spent 3 days producing 6 clean copies of the well specifications, annotated with Lusk's formation notes and Mara's practical adjustments from what she'd learned during the Red Willow drilling. Lusk, when presented with a copy, looked at it for a long time. "Your father's drawings are in here," he said. "Yes," she said. "With credit." He looked at the annotation on the first page where she'd written, in clear language, that the driving well design originated with her father, a blacksmith out of Pittsburgh, developed over 20 years of experimental work. She'd written his full name. Lusk closed the copy and held it. "He'd have been glad of that," he said. "I think so," she said. He handed it back. "I'll put mine with the county records," he said. "At the clerk's office, so there's a permanent copy that nobody can make disappear." She hadn't thought of that. "That's a good idea," she said. I have them occasionally, he said, with the dry precision that was his version of warmth. The spring damage case took longer than the rest of it, which was the nature of anything that went through proper legal channels. Bess connected them with a territorial attorney named Fisk, who worked out of Mandan and had the reputation of someone who took cases based on merit and was not afraid of well-resourced opponents. Fisk reviewed the evidence, the gravel, the maps, the timeline, the geological analysis, and said, without drama, that he thought the case was sound and he would take it on a contingency arrangement, meaning he took his fee from whatever was recovered rather than up front. This was not common. It told Mara something about what Fisk thought of the case. The legal process moved at its own pace, which was slow and occasionally maddening, but it moved. Pike's lawyers responded and filed counter-arguments, and there were procedural delays that Fisk navigated with the particular patience of someone accustomed to the deliberate rhythm of territorial courts. Through all of it, Pike remained in Crooked Creek. He did not disappear or concede. He was a man who had invested significantly in a scheme and was not going to abandon it without exhausting his options. The math kept turning. By February, 8 driven wells were producing water across the county. 2 more were being drilled. The ranchers who'd ordered pipe had received it. The railroad supply chain was efficient once you knew how to navigate it, which several people did now who hadn't before, and the community had developed an informal network of expertise, people who had watched the Red Willow, drilling passing what they'd learned to neighbors who were starting their own. Calder became, without anyone deciding this formally, the person other families sent their teenage sons to for instruction on the driving technique. He was 12 by February, his birthday fell on the 8th, which Maisie remembered, and Silas marked with a cake that was imperfect and the right thing, and he had the patient, exact teaching manner of someone who has learned something genuinely hard and remembers what it felt like not to know it. Mara watched this happen with the specific satisfaction of someone who understands that teaching is the highest form of a skill, not the doing but the transmitting. The moment when what you know becomes available to someone who didn't have it before. She didn't say any of this to Calder. He didn't need it said. He was doing it because it was useful and he was good at it, which were the 2 reasons that actually mattered. The forge business had grown past what she'd managed alone. She had 2 regular helpers now, Rose's youngest son, who had a natural feel for metal that she'd noticed during his father's repair pickups, and a woman named Eudora Crane, Aldous' niece, who had come to watch out of curiosity and stayed because she was, as Mara recognized within 2 sessions, someone for whom forge work was not a novelty but a fit. She was 19 and had never been told she could do this. Mara told her in the direct way that serves better than encouragement, by handing her a hammer and showing her what to do with it, and then getting out of the way. The Northern Line contract came through in March. It was a seasonal arrangement spring and fall, 6 weeks each. Maintenance work on locomotive fittings at a rate that was almost startling compared to county forge work, because railroad equipment operated at scales that made ordinary smithing look preliminary. Petrie wrote with the contract details and added, in his characteristically abrupt way, "Good work doesn't stay local forever. This is it leaving." She read that to Silas, who said, "He's right," with a quiet satisfaction that was as much about her as about the money. The money changed what was possible. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady accumulating way that financial stability actually works not a flood, but a rising level, a slow achievement of a margin between what you have and what you need. They bought coal in quantity, which reduced the per-unit cost. They bought a new bellows, the first new equipment the forge had seen in decades. Silas added 20 head of cattle in March and another 30 in April, watered by the well that ran without interruption through the coldest winter the territory had seen in years. The Henderson parcel came back to Red Willow Ranch in April, not as part of Pike's offered deal but as a settlement term in the spring damage case, which Fisk negotiated with the particular skill of someone who knew exactly how to present evidence and exactly when the other side's calculation had shifted from fighting to managing the loss. Pike's lawyers agreed to the transfer of the parcel, a cash payment for documented damages to the spring system, and a legal restriction on further drainage development in the gravel formation's recharge zone. Pike did not come to the settlement. His lawyers signed. He left Crooked Creek in May. No announcement, no farewell, no explanation to the people he'd done business with. He sold his remaining properties, including the Ridgeland, which was purchased by a consortium of 3 ranchers who formally registered the recharge zone as a shared conservation area, with Bess overseeing the documentation, and he went wherever men like Pike go when a place has stopped being profitable. Somewhere else. Somewhere with different people who didn't yet know how he worked. Mara didn't feel triumphant when she heard he'd gone. She felt mostly tired. And then not tired the specific relief of removing a weight you've been carrying so long you'd stop noticing it as a separate thing. She was at the forge when Silas told her. "It's done," he said from the doorway. "Good," she said. She kept working. He came inside and sat on the 3-legged stool and watched her work for a while. This had become something he did not often, not every day. But sometimes, when the evening was quiet enough and the children were settled and he had time that wasn't claimed by anything. He didn't talk while she worked. He just sat there, which she had come to understand was not passive but a kind of active presence, the presence of someone who has decided that being near a thing is its own form of participation, stopped finding it unusual. She'd started, somewhere in the long middle of winter, finding it something else, something she didn't have a word for, that was in the territory of comfort, the warm-edged variety, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Lusk came by this afternoon, Silas said when she banked the fire. "What for, the fence survey?" He paused. "We went out and walked it together." The 40 yards, she looked at him. "He's right," Silas said. "The original boundary was moved. Not by my father intentionally, I don't think, but the 1,879 survey has an error in it that favors our side by 40 for its or." He looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm going to deed him the strip. Just like that," she said. "Just like that," he said. "It's his land. Whether my father knew it or not, it's his land." She looked at him. "That'll cost you with some people. The old-timers who knew your father. They'll say you're." "I don't care what they say," he said. It was quiet, and it was completely real, and she believed it. "My father was not always the man he should have been. I can't fix that, but I can stop benefiting from his mistakes." She turned back to the cooling forge. "He'll respect you for it," she said. "I'm not doing it for his respect," Silas said. "I'm doing it because it's right." She smiled, though she was facing away from him. "I know," she said. In the end, what surprised her most was not the well or the board meeting or Pike's departure or even the legal settlement. What surprised her was the ordinary texture of the days that came after the dailiness of a life that had stopped being a crisis and become simply a life. It was not uncomplicated. She had not become a different person. She was still someone who solved before she felt, who worked before she talked, who was more comfortable with iron than with words, and had to translate deliberately between what she understood and what people needed to hear. Silas was still a man whose grief was not finished, who sometimes went quiet in the evening, in the way that meant he was somewhere else, not far and not unreachable, but somewhere she couldn't follow, which she had learned to accept without taking personally. Calder was still angry sometimes at things that had nothing to do with her and things that had everything to do with the years before she arrived. The specific anger of a child who learned too early that the world does not protect the people you love just because you need it to. He was also, increasingly, a young person she found she genuinely liked his precision, his stubbornness, his refusal to do anything by half measure. He had her father's thoroughness without ever having met him, which she noticed and did not say anything about, because some things are better observed than named. Maisie was 7 in June and had the bright, insistent energy of a child who has decided that the world is basically trustworthy, which is a decision children make based on evidence, and which Maisie had arrived at through some combination of the repaired doll and the evenings in the forge and the fact that Mara never, not once, tried to answer for her mother or occupy her mother's place. She had simply been present, adjacent, A different kind of person filling a different kind of space. It was, she thought, the most she could offer and possibly the right amount. One morning in late May, Maisie came to the forge before school with a broken hinge from her wooden toy chest. She set it on the workbench with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has learned that this is where broken things go. "Can you fix it?" she said. "Yes," Mara said. "Come after school." Maisie came after school and watched it fixed, which took 8 minutes. When it was done, she held it carefully and looked at it and then looked up. "Mama used to fix things," she said, "with string and paste and things like that." "That works for a lot of things," Mara said. "You fix them differently." "I do," Mara agreed. Maisie considered this. "I like both ways," she said, with the careful equity of a 7-year-old who has thought about fairness quite a lot. "That's a sensible position," Mara said. Maisie went to put the hinge back on her toy chest, and Mara stood at the forge for a moment, after she left with the small residual warmth of a conversation that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. She hung her father's hammer on the wall above the forge that evening. Not ceremoniously, she just put in the nail and hung it there, where the light caught the head and the worn handle showed 40 years of use in the specific smoothness that only comes from one person's grip over a long time. She'd been meaning to hang it for months, and the right moment had kept not arriving, so she stopped waiting for it. Then she went to the smaller forge and took the piece she'd been working on for 3 weeks. It was a hammer, not identical to her father's. She didn't want identical, and Silas didn't need identical. What he needed was what she'd built, which was a hammer weighted and balanced for the specific way his damaged hand actually worked. The head was heavier toward the striking face, which compensated for the lack of follow-through grip. The handle was shorter than standard, which brought the work closer to the forearm strength that was his reliable source of force. Balance point was 1.5 inches forward of where a standard hammer balanced. She'd tested it herself. It worked. She stamped the initials into the head SR, clear and deep, into the metal that would carry them as long as the hammer lasted, which was a very long time when something is made right. She hung it beside her father's hammer, 2 hammers. One belonging to a man who had built things in Pittsburgh for 30 years and whose careful failures had pointed the way to the one success that changed a county. One belonging to a man who had fallen off a barn roof and spent 3 years believing his useful life was behind him, and who had, in the end, delivered the final blows that opened a pressurized aquifer with the same controlled steadiness he brought to everything he'd decided to do. They looked right beside each other. She stood and looked at them for a moment. That was all the ceremony she needed. Silas found them the next morning. He came into the forge early before she was there, and she knew he'd found them because she could see from the house window that he'd stopped moving and was just standing. She gave him a few minutes. Then she brought coffee. He was looking at his initials in the head of the hammer. "You didn't tell me you were making this," he said. "It's not the kind of thing you tell someone," she said. "It's the kind you finish and hang up." He took it off the wall. He held it. He found the balance point. She watched him feel for it, the adjustment of a man who has learned to trust his sense of weight, since his grip can't tell him what it used to, and she saw when he found it, the slight shift in his shoulders. "It's right," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. He was holding her father's life's work in one hand, and a hammer made for his damaged hand in the other, and the morning light came through the forge window the way it always did, ordinary and cold and sufficient. "Silas," she said. "Yes, the east pasture needs a new fence post line before the summer cattle rotation. Posts, and the ground is still soft enough to set them properly." She took his coffee cup and put her own in his hand. "I thought we could do it together this weekend. You and me and Calder." He looked at her. He understood, as she'd known he would, that this was not about fence posts. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up her tongs. Outside, the well was running. It had not stopped since the day they'd struck the aquifer through the worst of winter, through the freeze and the thaw, through everything that had happened and everything still being worked out. The water came up from 60 feet below the frozen prairie, and it ran clean and steady, and it did not ask anything of anyone. It simply did what it had always been doing, down there in the dark, waiting for someone to put the pipe in the right place and find it. 12 wells across the county now ran on the same principle. The copies of her father's plans sat in 12 kitchens and in the county clerk's permanent record, where they would outlast anyone currently living and serve people who hadn't been born yet. 3 families who'd been closest to selling had not sold. 2 who'd come close to losing cattle through the hardest weeks of January had not lost them. Eudora Crane was becoming a blacksmith in the way that someone becomes what they were meant to be, not quickly, not easily, but with the particular conviction of a person who has found the right fit and intends to see it through. None of this was finished. Mara understood that, because she was a practical person, and practical people do not mistake a pause for an ending. The spring damage settlement would need to be monitored. The fence survey would take time to formalize, and Lusk would need documentation. The Northern Line contract would bring its own complications. Calder's anger would not vanish just because circumstances had improved. The causes of it were older than that and would need longer to work themselves out. And she and Silas were 2 imperfect people who had come to this from completely different directions and were learning each other with the careful, uncertain attention of people who know that what they're building matters and are therefore afraid of building it wrong. But the water was running. The forge was lit. The hammer on the wall had her husband's initials in it, and she had put them there because a damaged hand does not require a damaged life. Because broken is not the same as finished. Because the old way stopping is not the end of the story, it's the moment where the story actually starts, when you find out who has the specific courage to stop grieving the thing that's gone and build toward what could still be. That was what her father had believed in the forge in Pittsburgh, writing in his margins. That was what the driven well plans represented, not a single solution, but a method of thinking, the willingness to go deeper when the surface has failed you, to trust that what you need is still there if you're willing to put in the pipe and wait. She hadn't come to Red Willow Ranch knowing she'd stay. She'd come because a woman she barely knew had gotten married in Fargo and asked her to return some money, and she'd been heading west anyway because her own shop was gone and she needed somewhere to be. She'd stepped off a train with a tool chest, and a man had looked at her with the exhausted bewilderment of someone who'd been waiting for a different person. And she'd told him maybe he got lucky. She'd been right about that, not because things had worked out smoothly. They hadn't. Not because she'd been competent and capable and had done everything correctly. She'd guessed wrong about the timeline twice. She'd underestimated how long the legal process would take. She'd been too slow to see Pike's mortgage maneuver coming. And there were moments in January, in the worst of the cold, when she'd lain awake in the room that had been a storage room and wondered if the aquifer would fail, if Lusk's maps were wrong, if her father's plans had a flaw she hadn't seen. She'd been right because she'd stayed, because she'd looked at something broken and asked what it needed instead of deciding what it was, because she'd given a man a hammer built for his actual hand rather than the hand he used to have. That was all. That was the whole of it. On the last evening of May, with the temperature finally soft enough to sit outside without suffering for it, Silas brought 2 chairs to the yard, and they sat and watched the light go off the prairie in the long, slow way it does in spring, the sky staying lit well past when you expect it to give up. Maisie fell asleep in her chair. Calder sat on the ground with his back against the well housing, reading something by the fading light, and when it finally got too dark, he closed the book and sat there anyway, which was what you did when a place was good enough to sit in without needing anything to happen. "You know what I've been thinking about," Silas said. "Tell me," she said. "That morning on the platform," he said. "I was so sure I knew what I needed, what the right thing would look like." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that if Clara Beecham had been on that train, if everything had gone the way I'd planned, I'd have thought I'd gotten what I needed. And I'd have been wrong." She looked at the last of the light on the grass. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No," he said. "That's what I keep thinking. You can't know what the right thing looks like until it's already in front of you." He paused. "You can only know what you thought you needed, and whether you were humble enough to recognize something better when it showed up." She thought about the platform, about the tool chest, about the look on his face, not hostile, Not disappointed exactly, just bewildered by the gap between what he'd expected and what had arrived. "It wasn't what you ordered," she said. "No," he said. "You weren't." A pause. "I got lucky," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the open expression, not careful, not measured, just direct and honest and there, the way he'd learned to be, or maybe always had been under the parts that fear built up around the places it's been hurt. "Yes," she said. "You did." The sky finished what it was doing. Prairie went dark around them. Wide and patient, the same land it had always been, indifferent to the specific human struggles being conducted on its surface, and underneath it, holding its water 60 feet down the way it had held it for 10,000 years. The well ran on in the dark. And in the forge, 2 hammers hung on the wall side by side, and the last heat of the banked fire held the room warm past midnight, the way a good fire does when it's been built right and given the right air and asked to last.